Professor Mark Kramer will be late, so we'll start immediately. So I would like to welcome to the floor Dr. Wojciech Kozłowski, who's the director of the Pilecki Institute. He will deliver the first speech, and then so, Director, the floor is yours.
And then Brzeziński, good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? I have a feeling that it's like, okay. So I would like to extend my cordial welcome to all of you here at the beginning of our conference. Our meaning Pilecki Institute and a group of very prominent and distinguished partners. The conference on the future of Central and East European studies in the light of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. This conference has been quite long in making, and this is because it's always a challenge and a, difficult task to put together a nice, powerful, would say, committee of important organizations and institutions that they come together to ask important questions. And I would like to begin with my, sincere gratitude to our partners, that you will hear from them in a moment, that we are actually successful, and at 9 a.m. today we can commence with an enterprise that I believe will take us somewhere that will contribute to answering this question: what's the future of our Central and East European studies? I'm grateful not only to our partners, I'm also grateful to our team at the Pilecki Institute, our Center for Totalitarian Studies that has been the spiritus movens, the central piece, the most important cog in our entire machinery at the Pilecki Institute that actually brought us together here. And it will give us an opportunity. Professor Mark Kramer just entered. Hello, sir. So we got this opportunity, and I have seen their work, I have seen their commitment and dedication, and I believe that we are in a very good position right now to spend these 2.5 days discussing matters that hopefully will bring to fruition further projects, will generate new knowledge, and what I believe is most important about conferences, we have a chance to exchange our ideas, talk a little bit about what we have done. But with conferences that ask questions about the future, we can also spend some time on delineating the future ideas and where would you like to take the current state of the studies, looking forward to the next years and decades. Now, the reason for this conference is nicely explained in these two brochures, so I'm not going to read them, because everyone can read in this room. But I would like to say one thing. The discussion about the future of Central and East European studies comes from the understanding that Central and Eastern Europe as a region matters. And that this region is not a part of Central Europe viewed from German perspective or Eastern Europe viewed from Russian perspective. We are in between, and we all know that. But we have our stories, we have our experiences, and we can also study our region without assuming every single time the perspective of one of our large and powerful neighbors. And I think this is important, that we are trying to focus and emphasize our regionality, because as I heard recently from Dr. Kapica, he told me that he read a very learned article by a Chinese scholar who, in a prominent international journal, that would claim, or actually it would take the position of the current Russian perspective on what is Central Europe and what are the claims and expectations coming from Russia towards this area. Basically, it turned out that we need to start telling our stories. We have been doing this for years, and we have to continue. And perhaps through coordination and working together, we can even strengthen this perspective. Because otherwise, there is a good number of players out there on the international arena that will tell these stories from their perspectives. And it's fine, let them tell theirs, but don't forget that we have ours. And I believe that this meeting, this conference, is going to contribute exactly to that point. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for coming together, again, to my partners and to the Center for Totalitarian Studies and the entire Pilecki Institute's crew. And I wish you efficient, fruitful, and rewarding experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director. Now I would like to invite Professor Igor Konkolewski, who's the Director of the Center for Historical Research at Polish Academy of Science in Berlin. Professor Konkolewski, the floor is yours.
Dobroho dnia, dzień dobry, good morning to everyone. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Center for Historical Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Berlin, I would like to thank you for the invitation to be a part of this conference among such prominent partners from Poland and from abroad. It's really honor for us to participate in this conference actively, but also to support organization of this conference. The outbreak of Russia's full-scale war has also changed the balance of power in Europe and the world. Over the past year, in particular, we have seen in many countries, unfortunately, a weakening of interest in Ukraine's struggle against Russian aggression. Cautious voices in the vein of realpolitik, not to mention many populist groups in various countries in the European Union and the United States, questioning the need to support Ukraine, are causing our concern. These same forces are calling for a search for compromise solutions with Russia. We Poles, who lost our independence for 123 years, from the end of the 18th century to the beginning of the 20th century, and later experienced the occupation of two totalitarian systems at the beginning of World War II, should be well aware of what an attitude of submission to Russian imperialism can lead to. Therefore, we should, without hesitation, support the struggle of our brothers and sisters in Ukraine for our freedom and yours. Russia's war against Ukraine is a history lesson for all people in Poland and other Central European and Eastern European countries, and one of the most important experiences after the fall of communism at the end of the last century. Influenced by this experience, we are trying to take a different look at our history linking Poles and Ukrainians, but also at the history linking us, Poles and Ukrainians, to other European nations. from a family perspective, namely that of the European Union as our common house, we try to look to the future. This perspective requires, on the one hand, an open dialogue about the past, often difficult and filled with family conflicts. On the other hand, however, it is necessary that we, Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and Belarusians, can redefine our common heritage and experiences that reach beyond the long 19th century and short 20th century. I hope that the conference we begin today will contribute to finding and redefining what is our common heritage and legacy, what unites us, Poles and Ukrainians, as well as other nations of Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Igor Konkolewski. Now I would like to invite...
Thank you. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here with the Pilecki Institute. I've had very fruitful cooperation over the last several years. The ties between the Pilecki Institute and Harvard, I think, have been beneficial for both parties. And my center at Harvard was originally named, when it was created about more than 75 years ago. It was called the Russian Research Center. Now, obviously, then Russia was part of the Soviet Union. It always struck me as an odd name in that regard because it implied that nowhere in the Soviet Union other than Russia was worth studying, which unfortunately was quite a common outlook in the United States, is that the non-Russian republics, the 14 other republics of the Soviet Union, were often ignored. That was not something I did myself. I actually published a monograph in the 1990s on the role of Ukraine in the Soviet Czechoslovak crisis of 1968. And that was based almost entirely on archives in Ukraine that were already readily available at that point. Subsequently, in more recent years, starting after the 2014 Maidan revolution in Ukraine, the former KGB archive there became open as well, and it has functioned remarkably well. It's a fantastic archive. But beyond that, though, as well, I went to other republics of the Soviet Union after the breakup of the USSR, and was able also there to do fruitful research. So even early on, it struck me as an odd name, the Russian Research Center. The center was then renamed in 1996 as a result of a bequest from Catherine Davis, was renamed the Davis Center for Russian Studies, but initially it was only Russian Studies. And even though, again, there were people like me at the center who studied a great deal other than Russia. In fact, I never regarded myself primarily as a specialist in Russia. I was a specialist in the Soviet Union, but I regarded the Soviet Union as a larger entity that included many republics other than Russia. My own family, my father and mother were from Latvia, and my father's family were deported to the Gulag. So I was acutely conscious that there were republics other than Russia in the Soviet Union. In 1997, subsequently for legal reasons, the Davis Center's name was at point. So I very much welcome this conference, and particularly welcome that there are experts here who will be speaking about Russia, but also about many parts of the former Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe other than Russia. I also...
Thank you, Professor. So now I would like to invite Professor Bartosz Kaliski, who's the Deputy Director of the Instytut of History, Polish Academy of Science. Professor, the floor is yours.
Szanowni Państwo, mam honor dziś reprezentować mojego przełożonego, profesora Macieja Janowskiego, który jest dyrektorem Instytutu Historii Polskiej Akademii Nauk i cieszę się, że aż 3 instytucje... Szanowni Państwo, mam honor reprezentować tutaj mojego przełożonego, dyrektora Instytutu Historii Polskiej Akademii Nauk, Macieja Janowskiego, który jest członkiem Rady Naukowej konferencji. Niestety nie mógł dzisiaj przybyć. I cieszę się, że dziś aż 3 jednostki Polskiej Akademii Nauk współuczestniczą w organizacji tej konferencji, w tym Instytut Historii, ponieważ warto znać historię, warto śledzić historię Rosji, bo z przeszłości wynika zawsze to, co dzieje się przed naszymi oczami. Tam szukamy korzeni aktualnych wydarzeń i ten trud nie jest namarny. O tym na pewno będą rozmawiać uczestnicy wieczornego panelu dyskusyjnego dzisiaj. Wśród nich profesor Andrzej Nowak. Chciałbym zaznaczyć, że w Instytucie Historii pod jego kierownictwem, właśnie profesora Nowaka, działa od roku zespół do badań nad imperializmem rosyjskim. Zorganizował już 3 konferencje i nie jest to żadna konkurencja, bo chodzi o to, żeby tych konferencji było jak najwięcej. I sądzę, że te konferencje miały znaczenie międzynarodowe. Po co nam badanie przeszłości? Co ono może nam dać? To pytanie retoryczne dać może oczywiście wiele, przynajmniej ja tak uważam. Zapoznaję się właśnie z taką książką Piotra Wajla, Aleksandra Gielisa, lata 60. Świat sowieckiego człowieka. Rzecz, która nie wiem w jakich językach wyszła, ja czytam to w jakimś niszowym języku, ale rzecz jest ciekawa, to nie wykład, zajmę chwilę tylko. Portretuje lata 60. w panoramiczny, taki publicystyczny, znakomity sposób. Przypomina to, o czym się wie, ale czym żyło społeczeństwo sowieckie w latach 60., tutaj zamkniętych datami 1961, to zjazd Komunistycznej Partii Związku Radzieckiego, i rokiem 1968. Na zjeździe ogłoszono, że za 20 lat Związek Radziecki będzie żył w komunizmie, że wszyscy będą cieszyć się tymi darmowymi usługami publicznymi, darmowym jedzeniem w stołówkach, że latali w kosmos. Kiedy o Fidelu Castro, no nie, raczej Castrze, mówiło się familiarnie w Moskwie Fedia. Kiedy to sportowcy radzieccy bili na głowę niektórych sportowców anglosaskich, na przykład Walerii Brummel skakał znakomicie wzwyż, Igor Ter-Ovanesyan daleko w dal, Jurij Własow, ciężarowiec, podnosił znakomicie ciężary i bił rekordy świata. Wtedy to utopia zyskała nowy kształt i to wpłynęło na to społeczeństwo, a wpłynęło też być może na Władimira Putina, który miał wtedy lat kilkanaście i wtedy się dojrzewa, prawda? I po to jest badanie przeszłości, żebyśmy mogli się wczuć także w taką mroczną duszę tego przywódcy, żebyśmy zrozumieli, do czego on dąży. Może dąży do odbudowy tych snów o wielkości, tego złotego wieku lat 60. Związku Radzieckiego, kiedy to wydawało się, że wszystko jest możliwe, że Związek Radziecki jest jakimś wzorem. Ilja Ehrenburg, który wtedy wydał swoje pamiętniki, mieszał tam komunizm z humanizmem. Wydawało się, że ten świat był taki trochę piękny dla niektórych przynajmniej, choć wtedy już rodził się ruch dysydencki. Więc temu właśnie służy praca historyków, abyśmy szukali łączności między tym, co było, a tym, co jest. I abyśmy mogli przewidywać to, co może nadejść. Historia bowiem rzadko kiedy się powtarza, ale też rzadko bywa niestety zupełnie oryginalna. I w tym duchu chciałbym Państwu życzyć również owocnych obrad. Dziękuję.
Dziękuję, panie profesorze. Thank you very much. And last but not least, I would like to invite Dr. Adam Eberhard, who is the Deputy Director of the Institute of East European Studies at Warsaw University, our host today. So, Dr. Eberhard, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me welcome you warmly at this conference and express our great gratitude to the Pilecki Institute for inviting us to become a partner of this timely event. I very much appreciate, and let me use the opportunity to express how much I really admire the work of the Pilecki Institute, because what you have been doing in the last years is to prove that history is applicable, that history is a science that provides us with some answers to the challenges and questions we are facing today. But you know, just 1 month ago, we at the Studium Europy Wschodniej Center for East European Studies at the University of Warsaw have organized a second Congress of the history researchers of Poland, Lithuania, Belarus and Ukraine. It was also organized in the venues of the University of Warsaw. We have arranged 60 panels, hundreds of experts, scientists, historians who have been discussing common heritage of our nations. And I'm so happy about this event because it is a clear follow-up. Because 1 month ago we have been discussing the heritage, the history that links us, that is a connection, that is a trouble for many, because we have to work out some way of understanding the past. But this event is extremely important because it links history with the future. It links past with the future. It links history with politics, international relations, challenges we are facing today. So I'm really, really happy to be here. Once again, thank you very much for inviting us to become partner of this event, and looking forward to fruitful discussion during these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Eberhard. Thank you so much. We also are looking forward for future cooperation with Warsaw University and the Institute of East European Studies. You mentioned the conference last month. We were also happy to be a partner of this conference, and we were organizing a panel during this conference with people who I see in this room. They're smiling to Ian Garner. Thank you so much for all your introductions, for all your important words. The first day of the conference is supposed to set up the stage for further historical discussion during the second and third day. Because as you will see in the program, the first day is devoted to more to contemporary issues, which are of course rooted in history, also to international relations, to understand what's happening right now in international relations and the causes and the links to public history, to political history, to the importance of history as a science in the region, and all the important questions which were raised by our directors during the opening session. So right now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Igor Lukasz, who is a professor of history and international relations at Boston University. He's also an associate, as Professor Mark Kramer was telling us a few minutes before, an associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. He's also the honorary consul of the Czech Republic in the United States of America. Most of all, he's a well-known scholar of diplomacy. He's an author of the important book Czechoslovakia Between Hitler and Stalin, and many other books about diplomacy in the interwar period and also during the Second World War and after the war. So, but said that, I mean, most of the books are about which is at heart of the Pilecki Institute, about the topics of Second World War. But Professor Lukasz is delivering today another speech, because I don't know if you are aware of that Professor Lukasz also got an award from the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, in United States, because of his contribution to the scholarship of intelligence. So he's a... this is a secret. Oh my God! Sorry, Professor. It's unfortunately it's in the booklet. So So Professor, as Professor Kraber told us, will deliver an optimistic view about what's happening right now in the region. We hope for Professor Kramer to deliver a more pessimistic view. Tomorrow, the keynote of Professor Kramer will be tomorrow, and Professor Kramer will tell us about the importance of archives and the problem with accessing Russian archives right now because of the war. But right now, we want to have the smile on our faces, and we want to listen the optimistic vision of what's happening here in our region of Europe. Professor Lukasz, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Of course, you'll be invited to ask questions after the end of the lecture, so we are ready to ask questions.
So this works, right? Oh, we need the full view. Technology.
Shouldn't it be done by artificial intelligence?
Od początku. This is fine too, right? We can just work with what's there. Just make it fit the screen and we can work with this, right?
Can we give the presenter's view?
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you
Finally.
so much. Yes. Yes. This is an optimistic view of NATO's response, and I think if I have some ambition, it is to demonstrate that I'm not a naive. Of course, I know the situation is extremely serious, but I would like to maintain my optimism on the grounds that Putin has essentially missed the train to the 21st century and thinks in terms that perhaps were applicable in the 20th century, but hopefully have changed by now. So if I'm capable of some intellectual creativity, I would like to propose that there exists a parallel between the extremely cautious behavior of the United States in 1989 to the stunning changes that, of course, were in 1999 culminating in Eastern Europe and primarily in Poland, because the impetus, of course, came from Poland, and it was the round table, in my opinion, in 1989 here in Warsaw that ultimately led to the collapse of the status quo. So I would like to suggest that the cautious attitude Washington took in 1989 was pretty much similar to the very cautious attitude the United States takes now. If you are the national security advisor sitting in the White House, it's your job to worry about consequences of your president's actions. So it's not that he's lazy. It's not that he doesn't understand the evil of Putin. It's not that he doesn't understand the seriousness of the situation on the battlefield as it's evolving right now as we sit here in comfort and peace. He understands it, but he needs to worry about the consequences of what the United States might do. That's in his life, that's in his work description. So just as the United States was not triumphant in 1989, so it is cautious now in 2024. But the grounds for my optimism will be that the very concept of sovereignty and the very sources of what constitutes power, authority, influence in international relations, that those phenomena have changed. But since I am a historian, let me offer a few more or less humorous sort of probes into the past. I always find it fascinating that the Russians perceive themselves as victims, whereas all their neighbors perceive them as aggressors. You can, I think, well see it expressed on this on this humorous map. It reminds me of conversations I had with a very proud Polish American, General Rowney. He was a U.S. Army general, but very proud of his Polish roots. And he was, in the 80s, one of the lead American arms control negotiators. And I spoke with him a few times at that time, and he told me that the moment you sat down with the Soviet delegation to talk about arms control, the first arguments came, we're vulnerable. We have been invaded by, and now comes the whole litany, the Vikings, the Poles, the Swedes, the Napoleon, Hitler. It's an endless list of aggressors against Russia, and therefore we deserve more security than the United States. So give us a better deal. What's good enough for you is not good enough. In 1848, he was invited to take part in the Frankfurt Assembly gathering that was obviously going to, was going to attempt to redesign Germany, which was then, of course, divided into many different sovereign entities. And here is Pilecki's view on Soviet power. I will give you a few seconds to read it for your own. I think it's well worth it. Already in the 1830s, dealing with the expansionist tendencies of Russia, Karl Marx and Engels, in fact, quoted, I think in 1849, some of these articles and pointed out that that Russian power since the days of Peter the Great had expanded by hundreds, in some cases even over 1,000 kilometers toward Berlin and Tehran and other capitals of the world. So back to the present. I think you will remember that in 2021, it was, at least initially, a minority opinion that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. Even somber, rational people, the Kremlin felt the need to invade Czechoslovakia Czechoslovakia was the most obedient of all the satellite countries. It had no real rebellious tendencies. Yes, there was a quarrel at the highest levels of the party as to how to reform communism, but no one thought outside the framework that was accepted as legitimate by everyone in power. And moreover, the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries were in fact physically present in Czechoslovakia for a series of military exercises in Czechoslovakia, but they at least twice came in and then left again. And so I never understood why they had the need in this dramatic fashion to send hundreds of thousands of Russian special services owned the country. The Ukrainian military had barely existed in the 1990s. And so I never really understood why Putin had to ultimately do what he did in 2022. I think there is a certain similarity between that and 1968. So because Russia is considered by many a country that's very much on its own, sort of sui generis, I would submit that Russian rulers in many ways have followed the advice of the Grand Inquisitor. I'm sure many of you have read Brothers Karamazov. There is a great chapter called The Grand Inquisitor, and the Grand Inquisitor explains that there are three forces that every ruler needs to deploy if he wants to rule the rebellious humans. One is miracle, one is mystery, and then finally there is authority. So miracle, mystery, and authority. And I think people like Brezhnev in 1968 essentially followed the same pattern that Putin chose to follow in 2022. Miracle, mystery, and authority. Here is the beginning of my argument that in doing so, Putin demonstrated that he remains chained, anchored in a concept of power and sovereignty that perhaps made sense in the 20th century, but have stopped making sense in our century right now. I'm sure many of you have heard of Alfred Mackinder. People consider him to be the founder of geopolitics. He published a very influential article, I think 1903, 1905, which was then followed by a book in which he introduced the term geopolitics and argued that the 20th century would not be dominated by the great sea-going powers, as had been happening previously, the British, for instance, who built their empires because of the Navy. The 20th century, in his opinion, was going to be dominated by the great land powers, Germany and Russia. And he came up with a concept that he called the pivot states. Later, he turned it to, I think he called it the heartland in Eurasia. And his view was that who controlled the heartland of the Eurasian continent controlled the world. And the key was Ukraine. And Mackinder was studied very keenly in Germany and in Russia. And both countries appreciated the importance, as Hitler and Stalin later demonstrated amply, the importance of controlling Ukraine. Among the people who introduced Mackinder's ideas to the German speakers at that time was Karl Haushofer, a very interesting German intellectual who was both a professor as well as a general in the German army. And he, sadly enough, became a sort of a tutor to Adolf Hitler, and Hess, I think, also. When Hitler was briefly in the Bavarian prison in the 1920s, Haushofer, in fact, traveled twice a week to give him tutorials in that prison. Again, Hess, I think, sat on these tutorials also. And it was then that Haushofer impressed upon Hitler the importance for Germany in the future to ally Germany not with the so-called effete Austria, but rather with Russia and Japan. Haushofer was a great admirer of Japan, and if you ever wondered the origins of the future alliance between Stalin, Hitler, and the Japanese, there it was, Karl Haushofer. His son also followed in his father's footsteps, but he saw the light and joined the Stauffenberg conspiracy and was shot. I think at the very end of World War II, like at the end of April, he was shot in the already bombed out Berlin. And his father then took his life in 1946. So that was the end of Germany's love affair with geopolitics. So here is my argument that in the 1930s of the previous century, when the West saw a crisis in Eastern Europe, in East Central Europe, it attempted to appease the dictators. Everybody's seen these images of Chamberlain smiles and handshakes and signed pieces of paper that were supposed to deliver peace in our time. Everybody knows how that ended. After World War II, the West had desperately tried to figure out what awaited the Western Alliance once Hitler was defeated. Was it going to be possible to coexist with Stalin? Hopefully. Or would Stalin simply rise to become a substitute for the previous dictator whom the West had just dealt with in the great and destructive war? It turned out that something in between had evolved, and the West famously came up, or George Kennan came up with the concept of containment. So from appeasement, we moved to containment. So in the first instance, when there was trouble in Central Europe or East Central Europe, the West attempted to appease the dictator. In the second instance, the West attempted to build a tall wall around the problem in the hope that the viruses would not spill somehow onto the Western territory. But this containment eventually evolved. After the harsh years of Stalin and after the dangerous and unpredictable rule by Khrushchev, who gave the Cold War a few jolts of horror, the Berlin crises and, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, eventually the West had learned to coexist with the East. And I think these images speak for themselves. Here you have Nixon and Brezhnev shortly after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and I think the smiles were not fake. Of course they didn't like each other actually, But ultimately, they had discovered that if you follow the rules, the West figured out that for every crisis, you basically need a 3-ring binder, you know, a set of regulations. The State Department is very good at this. They talk about benchmarks and 3-ring binders, and for every eventuality, you know where to go, and you just go to the library and say, all right, if this happens, this is going to be our response. And eventually, you even had a genuine friendship. Throughout, the United States always angrily denied that it accepted Eastern Europe as being somehow exclusive zone of the Soviet Union. The United States pretended, and it knew that it was pretending, it pretended that Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the rest of Eastern Europe were sovereign entities. And it always went through the charade of talking to these East European governments as if they were on their own, as if they were actually sovereign actors. But everybody knew that they had to fulfill directions that came from the Kremlin. That was the public facade. That was what the outside world was supposed to hear or see. But in reality, people like Kissinger were very, very clear. When East Europeans came to Washington, especially Romanians were very sort of insistent on that, and suggested that they would seek somehow a greater degree of sovereignty for themselves. Kissinger or his staff would very explicitly say, you can't change the map. Russia cannot help but have an interest in you because you are where you are. And of course, this applied for theory to Poland and the other countries that are sandwiched in this inhospitable geographical space between the millstones of Germany on the one side and Russia on the other side. President Reagan is notoriously admired. I think the Poles even built a monument to him next to their embassy here in Washington. He's considered to be the liberator of Eastern Europe. I think it's Poland who is the liberator of Eastern Europe. At least this is my opinion. And when you ask John Whitehead, who was President Reagan's expert on Eastern Europe, he says, President Reagan, and I know one is not supposed to read one's own slides, but give me the pleasure, harbored absolutely no intention of detaching the states of Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union. What President Reagan, Whitehead said, really wanted to do was to negotiate genuine arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. President Reagan, partly for religious reasons and partly just for basic human instincts, considered nuclear weapons to be somehow immoral, not only horrific and so on, we all know that, but he also considered it somehow a violation of sort of principles of Christianity that he adhered to. And he very much wanted to, at one point, he even toyed with the idea of banning nuclear weapons, which I think horrified everyone around the president, although they didn't probably dare say it in his face. But since that didn't work, he at least attempted to come up with genuine reductions of the nuclear arsenals because he thought that it was immoral, not just dangerous, but also immoral. Now, when you jump ahead a little bit, here we are in July 1989. Bush comes to Warsaw. He is everywhere seen as a triumphant representative of the West that's about to win the Cold War competition with its despised opponent. And certainly in public, President Bush is full of smiles and flashing the victory sign, and you know, here is Wałęsa and so on. There was so much genuine sympathy for Poland at that time in the West. It's indescribable. As you know, Americans are reluctant to learn to pronounce foreign words, never mind languages, but everybody could pronounce Wałęsa, and of course the Pope was famous and so on. Poland, solidarity, these were words that every American household essentially somehow absorbed from the news. But behind the closed doors, here was Bush putting pressure on the recently elected Solidarity now senators, because Senate had already come into existence, and he demanded of them that they help re-elect Jaruzelski, the same man who had just recently put them in prison. And they looked at him in disbelief and so on, but ultimately this was the line that prevailed. And Bush was very clear. He said, our main objective is not to endanger Gorbachev, because if we allow trouble to develop in Eastern Europe, in countries especially like Poland, then that would give weapons to Gorbachev's critics in the Kremlin, and if he gets overthrown, who knows what happens? Some Lieutenant Ivanovich may seize control of some division and initiate a conflict that we had managed to avoid throughout the Cold War, so we shouldn't take these risks. From Warsaw, Bush went directly to Budapest, and his message was exactly the same. We're not going to do anything to endanger Gorbachev's position, which means we're not going to get involved in support of the democratic tendencies, which of course, at that point, Hungary had already basically reacquired its sovereignty. And so, provocatively, I would argue that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, you see a total paradox that I think has never been properly captured in the textbooks, certainly not in America, where all the high school textbooks, I know this from my daughter's experience, have President Reagan traveling to Berlin and saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And boom, the wall comes down, and therefore Reagan is the liberator of Eastern Europe. But in fact, I think that what you see in 1989 is a total reversal of that, where the West is essentially defending the status quo. Margaret Thatcher especially, she in fact even telephoned Gorbachev and demanded that he use the Red Army to essentially rebuild the Berlin Wall that had just been breached. And Gorbachev listened in disbelief to her demands. Whereas Gorbachev is pushing for more change. I think about a week ago, there was very interesting information discovered in Prague in the archives that in fact confirms the idea that it was the Soviets who were pushing to overthrow the arch-conservative communist government in Prague in November '89, in the hope of replacing it with some reform communists who would be more willing to follow the line set by Gorbachev. So at the end of the Cold War, at the end of 1989, President Bush famously, when he was told that the Berlin Wall had just been breached, he said, I'm not going to dance on the wall. And I would submit to you that this was without many precedents in history, because previously, when you won a conflict, especially one that was prolonged and very expensive, such as the Cold War, you celebrated it. Right? When the British left New York City in the 18th century, General Washington on his horse rode into New York in great triumph. When the Americans liberated Paris, as Warsaw was dying, Paris was dancing, but the Americans paraded up and down Champs-Élysées because they celebrated their victory. Right? At the end of the Cold War, there was no celebration on the part of the West. And I submit that this was something that ultimately would have great consequences. And one of those consequences was that the West, never really feeling victorious, didn't feel called upon to get involved in some sort of moral renewal of Eastern Europe. Never mind the former Soviet Union that was already falling apart. And therefore, not only do you see the rise of the despicable bankers, the oligarchs, but you also see a destruction of the values, because concepts such as democracy or free market economy or capitalism, I think, were irreparably hurt in the 1990s, precisely because of the sort of Western reluctance to admit that it had just won a great victory in the Cold War. And so this, I think, has allowed Putin to ultimately come up with this, I call it the big lie, but there are many others, I'm sure. But if you actually read it, you see that this is the one idea that I think has helped him to maintain his popularity. When you look at the opinion polls, insofar that one can trust these at all, of course, in a country such as present-day Russia, it seems that his opinion, his approval rate, his rating is around 80%. It's without many precedents anywhere else in the West. And I think this is a total lie, because the West never really wanted to destroy Russia. I think the West, from the get-go, wanted to be able to sell Levi's and Marlboro cigarettes and Playboy magazine and alcohol and I don't know what else. Simply, the West wanted to do business with Russia. Germany, of course, famously had done everything it could to make itself dependent on Russian energy. And I remember already this started with Chancellor Schmidt, and there were conflicts between Brzezinski, who was then Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, and it continued throughout the Reagan presidency for 8 years, that the Germans were doing everything they could to somehow make themselves dependent on oil and gas coming out of Russia, in the hope that they would somehow weave Russia, or Soviet Union and later Russia, into the fabric of quote-unquote civilized Western Europe and influence Russia's values and thinking and so on. And of course, we know how that ended. The same was true for the Brits, who were notorious about this. Somehow the font has changed with the transfers from one computer to another, so you can't, I can see it now, read it, but you're not missing anything. I think the images speak for themselves. I'm told that at some point there were like 70,000 Russians in London that helped celebrate the Russian New Year. The Brits completely changed their tax laws in order to make London a haven for the richest Russians who purchased large parts of the city. And yet Putin, of course, talks about the West trying to destroy them. I think they were very eager to coexist. The same was true for the United States. Bill Clinton was famous for laughing with Yeltsin. Yeltsin was routinely drunk during their meetings, and Clinton would always pretend that it was very funny what Boris had just said. It really wasn't funny, it was just drunk drivel. But they were very polite with the Russians, as they would not have been polite with Poles or Czechs or some other people, for the simple reason that they always believed that Russia was hugely important. Bush even assured the Western journalists that he and Putin had one thing in common, he said. They loved Jesus. And Putin very cleverly played upon this and gave him his baptismal cross, because he claimed that his mother, of course, you know, KGB all over the place, and he claimed that his mother had him secretly baptized. I'm not saying he wasn't secretly baptized, but he then supposedly gave this cross that he received on his baptism, and he gave it to President Bush, who found him to be a very trustworthy and straightforward person. So, in short, the United States, far from trying to destroy Holy Russia, as Putin has now been weeping all over the place, in fact, it maintained very cordial relations until Putin started offending people like Hillary Clinton. I think there was an occasion when Secretary of State Clinton was supposed to meet him, and he kept her waiting for something like 45 minutes. And Secretary Clinton is not a woman you can treat this way. So he comes 45 minutes late, then he sort of manspreads, I think is the current English word, sort of wraps himself around his chair, never utters an apology, and looks bored. Well, that didn't really look all that well, and the smiles started fading by the time of the stolen election in December 2011, and then, of course, ultimately after Maidan. But it needs to be stressed that Maidan itself in 2013 was not initially motivated by Ukraine's desire to join the European Union or to join NATO. It was initially motivated by a struggle against corruption. This is how Maidan had started. It then obviously evolved into something different. But here is my parallel, that prior to the end of the Cold War, the West tried not to interfere in Eastern Europe, and as far as Ukraine after the Cold War was concerned, the West was, in my opinion, oblivious. It slumbered from 1991, the end of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day, all the way until Maidan. It had done nothing. And yet, pretty much every government in Kyiv, including those who were puppets of the Kremlin, and that was probably the majority, every single one declared that the objective of Ukraine was to join Europe, ultimately. And of course, the West had, as I say, had done really nothing until Maidan. There is a new book coming out by the famous journalist Woodward, who has incredible sources in Washington. He is the man who broke Watergate and some other famous events. And this is a quote from his book, which I have from the media because the book had not been yet released. And here is President Biden essentially saying, it's our problem. We had done nothing. Obama had done nothing. And now I'm facing the situation involving Russian invasion, and it is a consequence of our behavior. There is Putin with the former defense minister Shoigu being their usual macho self. So if Mark was asking for the sources of my optimism, it is not that I'm blind to the situation on the battlefield, which is not good, but it is the belief that we have moved from appeasement via containment to a new era in the 21st century, which is called persistent engagement. The Pentagon has a new brochure that describes what it's actually supposed to be. They either sometimes call it defend forward. That's the new, what used to be called containment is now called defend forward, or persistent engagement. And it's an acknowledgement that what used to be defined as territorial sovereignty used to be defined by who controls a piece of real estate and whose law is applicable. You know, like here, who owns this piece of land? Whose law applies here? Okay? That is the concept of sovereignty that dated back to the treaties of Westphalia, I think 1648, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, 1648. Whereas now we talk about informational. First we had the concept of data sovereignty, means you want to control your data. And now it's not just data, it's also the networks that communicate the data. And that is now quickly replacing the concept of sovereignty that is defined by land. This is, I believe, a genuine photograph taken of the Earth from space, and it shows you satellites. And now pretty much every country, in the past it was just a few large countries, now it's even middle-sized countries have their own satellite systems. And I attended a talk by somebody who really worked on these projects and these secret systems, and he said that basically everyone who has satellites in space is constantly trying to break into the other side's system, not because they want to somehow do something malicious, but because in order to maintain the status quo, you need to know what the other side is doing. And so to defend yourself, you have to be proactive, hence defend forward, or persistent engagement. And I submit that if the West reacted differently to Ukraine, it isn't then to Poland in 1970 and throughout the 1980s, or Czechoslovakia 68, Poland, Hungary 56, etc. It is not that the West had seen the light. It is rather that we live in a different technological era. And you cannot sit and think, it's happening in Poland, we have a big fence that protects us from it, we're okay, we don't need to do anything. I would argue that that is the source of optimism, that sovereignty is not what used to be as a result of a treaty signed in 1555, cuius regio eius religio, or cuius regio eius religio plus sovereignty, 1648. It is now something different because the real competition takes place in space between satellite systems, because if you want to drink water from the tap or turn on the lights, you need computers, and all of this can be turned on and off by people who could break into your satellite systems that are in space. So now the sovereignty involves data and informational networks rather than pieces of land. Whereas Putin is wedded to the idea that this is the source of strength, divisions and armor and that sort of thing. And yes, this is the way they beat Napoleon. Yes, this is the way they beat Hitler, but I wonder whether these are the instruments for success in the 21st century. One of the most revealing things I have seen coming out of Russia was an article by this really complicated, strange fellow called Surkov, who has been sort of in and out of favor with the Kremlin. And he, look at the date, 15 February 2022, published an article that sadly enough has never been translated, to the best of my knowledge, into English, but is very revealing. It's called The End of a Shameful Peace. I'm sure to many of you it immediately evokes the Versailles Treaty, which Hitler hated so much. Remember the hated Versailles, as Hitler loved to say with utter contempt. So here is Surkov talking about shameful peace. And there are these 3 points that, in my opinion, speak for themselves. Unfortunately, I came across the article about 10 days after the invasion. And had I read it then, on the 15th, I would have been somewhat better informed. Essentially, what Surkov is saying can be summed up very simply. It says for Russia to exist, she needs to be dignified. For Russia to feel dignified, she needs land. In order to have land, Russia needs to be feared. And that may have been true in the days of Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor. That is not the case in the 21st century. Look at the most successful countries in the world. They're not big. They don't have great enterprises. They have smart ideas. That's the 21st century. So he goes into Ukraine in February 22, convinced that the effete West, like the effete Habsburgs, would simply take some yachts from some oligarchs, no loss to Putin. Instead, the West had been heavily engaged. I spoke, I don't even know the man's name, but I spoke with a Green Beret general who told me that it was a few weeks after the invasion of Ukraine. And I spoke with a Green Beret general who told me that he had left Ukraine in January 2022. The United States had been involved. And thank God for that. And this is one of the consequences. We all know, even I know, I was 18 in '68. I can't tell you what awesome sight it is when you hear a tank thundering toward you on the streets of your own city. I'm sure I was one of millions who experienced it in Budapest, who experienced it in Prague and elsewhere. It didn't quite work that way in Kyiv because we live in a different era. And here I have a few slides that show the succession of time that to me demonstrate how defend forward or persistent engagement have replaced previous ways of Western attitude toward crises in Eastern Europe. Right? At the end of October, the United States intelligence community had evidence of Putin's plans. It involved not only aerial photographs, evidence of divisions and armor and even fighter planes. It's always very expensive to keep fighter planes out of hangars. So that always is a sign. But the United States had human sources in the Kremlin. And in the past, they wouldn't have uttered a word about it. Here, the President of the United States says Russia will attack, that is without precedent, then the director of Central Intelligence Agency travels to Moscow. I can't impress how unusual it is for the DCI to travel to the den of the opponent. It is a very risky enterprise. And there he and the ambassador of the United States speak with different dignitaries, I think Patrushev especially, and say, don't do it. We know what you want to do. Don't do it. It won't be good for you. And Patrushev, in this Russian way, you know, like gubernator, he just sends them away. We're a great superpower. You will not dictate to us. Again, for some reason, this is unreadable, but you can read much of it. Again, this is totally without precedent that you know, Russia is ready to attack in hours. It is the BND, that's German intelligence, obviously, are in Kyiv. There was the British defense minister was in Kyiv also, just days or hours before the invasion started. When the invasion started, the CIA was ordered to withdraw from Kyiv, and however, it only moved to a different location in western Ukraine. And when the offensive, when the attempt to take Kyiv had failed, the CIA just returned. That is defend forward. This is what I mean. This never would have happened in the days of Munich. There are many things that smack of appeasement. I would have loved to see a more vigorous Western reaction. But what we have, although imperfect, is vastly better than what we had experienced before. And I think I'm really running out of time, right? So I think I will just sum this up very quickly. I don't understand why the West continues making the same mistake of treating Russia as a great superpower. It is a country in desperate straits. It has an unprecedented public health crisis. Maybe the second of the two bullet points tells you that a life expectancy of a 15-year-old boy in Russia is the same as the life expectancy of a 15-year-old boy in Haiti. Nicholas Eberstadt is a highly regarded American demographer who has studied Russian public health, and this is what he says. I think it's very relevant. Russia is a country full of incredibly smart people, but for some reason they have not been able to translate this into knowledge and economic value. According to Asselund, the Russian GDP is 1.9 trillion. There are other sources that indicate a higher number, but Asselund is a highly regarded specialist on Russian economy. Just look at that. In fact, 2 days ago, the Nobel Prize in Economics went to 3 professors, 2 from MIT, 1 from Chicago. And essentially what they say is that economic development is best suited in countries that create essentially democratic countries that have decentralized institutions. And I'm stressing this because it's, of course, the opposite of Russia. So whatever Putin says will not ultimately work. And here is that paradox that Russia conducts itself as a superpower, although it's weak, whereas the West is the superpower, and yet it's extremely cautious for similar reasons why the West was so cautious in 1989. So in order to conclude, I would just say that if I were invited now miraculously by Mr. Putin, I probably wouldn't go. But if he wanted my opinion as to what he should do or what Russia should do, I would say, well, look at Western Europe that after World War II had given up on its colonies. And they have done pretty well for themselves. They have built they have had decades of unprecedented peace and economic prosperity. Look at Austria today. When it maintained the Habsburg Empire, when it fought for Bosnia-Herzegovina and these godforsaken places, it was the sort of an empire on decline. After World War II, Austria, after especially 1955 with the withdrawal and neutralization of Austria, Austria ultimately became, I think, one of the two, if not the most prosperous country of the European Union. So if now somebody came to Austria and say, please take back Bosnia-Herzegovina, they would probably say, nein, danke. We are done with empire. And I think Russia needs to be able to reach that point where it says, nein, danke, to its imperialist tendencies. That, to me, is the only way forward. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Professor, thank you so much for this interesting talk. I would really love to open the floor to questions, but unfortunately we already entered the coffee break, so I hope you'll collect your questions, and maybe if Professor Lukasz will be so nice, yeah, and to answer during the coffee break, because in 15 minutes, if I'm correct, we are starting our sessions in 3 separate rooms, and then I invite you to another keynote today, which will be delivered by Professor Marek Cichocki at 1 o'clock, and he will continue more or less the topic of Professor Lukasz and tell us more about paradigm shifts in analyzing Central and Eastern Europe. And afternoon at 4 o'clock, I invite you to our partners panels, the Institute of History by Polish Academy of Science, which will be moderated by Professor Andrzej Nowak, a very well-known and a distinguished historian in Poland. And they will talk about imperialism today, what does it mean in 21st century imperialism in this part of the region, and of course Russian imperialism. So please join, and please enjoy your coffee break. And once again, Professor Lukasz, thank you so much. This was very interesting. I would also like to comment because I have many questions, and but hopefully you'll be happy to answer them also later. Thank you so much. The coffee and tea and some cakes are on the first floor. So you have to go up, take the stairs, yellow stairs, and see you in the sessions. Thank you. To be fresh for what's coming next. So now we are going to have another keynote speaker, which is Professor Marek Cichocki, a professor of History and International Relations at Collegium Civitas and also College of Europe in Natolin. Professor Marek Cichocki I mean, he already, I think he was one of, I would say, fathers of the Pilecki Institute in some way. I mean, because he's connected with the Institute with the early beginning. But he's an expert in Polish-German relations, and you can follow his speeches, lectures on YouTube, which I encourage you to do. And today, the keynote address will be about the changing historical paradigms in the studying of Central Eastern Europe after the end of communism. So, Professor Cichocki, I invite you here. The floor is yours.
Tłumaczę jeszcze. Thank you very much. As you have, if you could hear, at first Professor Cichocki is rather undefined object or hard to be defined object. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I am really honored to be here, and this is also my personally, it is a great pleasure to me to be here in this place, because I spent in this place 7 years as a student in 80s. It was the same place, but of course not the same building. And now I am for the first time in this new building, and I'm really impressed how it looks, and I think it's a good illustration of the progress we made since 80s, of course. I would like to share with you some observations and reflections in my speech on the problem of the Cold War, the end of Cold War, the concept of the post-Cold War order, and now the attempt to understand the course of affairs around us by using another concept and another paradigm, the paradigm of the new Cold War, or the Cold War new or second, what you like, and especially how these different paradigms work in the context of the historical experience of the Central and Eastern Europe. I was asked to speak 1 hour, so I took the advantage to prepare the speech for 1 hour. And of course, I would be delighted if we could also discuss later on the topic, and I will be pleased to answer your questions, but of course in more informal way than here in the frame of this speech. So my first observation is about Central and Eastern Europe as a movable region, and about certain key turning points which change the way how this movable region works and is perceived. The dispute about how to geographically define the Central and Eastern European region has a long intellectual history. However, one basic regularity can be noted. With the emergence of the modern European order in 18th century, the region has become a movable area, a part of Europe shifted according to the balance of power between the external continental powers, and with the World War I also by non-European powers. This loss of its own political subjectivity and political and international gravity has become a dominant feature of this part of Europe, and overcoming it was one of the more important goals, desires, and aspirations of the peoples living in Central and Eastern Europe. In this process of shifting the region and formatting it by powers. We can find turning moments that result in change of ways how the region was functioning in Europe, as well as of its perception and understanding. There are several such turning points in modern history, and each will be significant for the region. I have in mind, for example, the turning point, de facto the final end of the old Westphalian system of order on the continent, which was the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Also the pan-European Napoleonic Wars leading Europe to the Congress of Vienna and the European Concert of Powers. Subsequent turning points were the revolutions of 1848-49 under the right of self-determination, the unification of Germany in 1871, and then the outbreak of the World War I and the Congress of Versailles, and finally World War II and the outset of the Cold War, which George Orwell aptly called once the peace that was no peace. Each time we are confronted with events that change the position of the Central and Eastern European region and consequently gave it different geopolitical and geocultural and geo-ideological perspectives. It has also led to the re-evaluation of views on what this part of Europe actually is and what it should be. The easternmost bridgehead of the Western order vis-à-vis Asia, a buffer against Russia expansion deep into the continent, an area of division of the spheres of influence between the continental powers, or perhaps a self-contained and self-defined region of coexisting states, peoples, and cultures. The end of the Cold War is crucial for this story, I think, and for the old problem of the changing positioning of Central and Eastern Europe on the continent. The special significance of that moment, 35 years ago, was the fact that the end of the Cold War represented an enormous potential, European and globally, of hope for a real epochal breakthrough, the emergence of a new type of pan-European and global peace order of a fundamental, epoch-making, transformative nature. For it was to be a peace that opened up an entirely new post-historical and post-political, even one could say Heliastic time. The outset of Weltinnenpolitik, as Jürgen Habermas called it, a moment of the liberal arc of history, as Barack Obama stated later, or simply the end of history, as conceptually described by Francis Fukuyama in his famous book. From the perspective of this movable character of the region of Central and Eastern Europe, as its exceptional historical curse, the end of the Cold War meant the promise of the end of all old painful geopolitical and ideological burdens and constraints. Also the moment of the emergence of space for its own free regional consolidation, and finally the path to join Western Europe in process of European integration. However, after 1989, there was still a phantom of the old divisions in the region, in form, for example, of such concepts and realities as the so-called post-Soviet area, which signaled the existence of a different world of the former Soviet republics on the one side, and on the other side, undergoing liberal Western economic and systemic transformation of Central Europe, moving towards the European Union and NATO. But the general hope prevailed that with the end of the Cold War, with irreversible end of the old ideological, systemic and geopolitical divisions, the way to a harmonious transformation of the entire region in line with the new global directions is open for everybody. So, my thesis is that despite those hopes for the end of history, now, with the Russian-Ukrainian war, we are entering a new turning point, which again, by the potential of its consequences, is already changing the position and perspective of our entire region in Europe. Usually, such a change also means revising old historical narratives, often written by politics and by nations for certain concrete purposes. Also, the search for new ones. It is therefore a significant issue worth of deeper consideration, to which I would like to devote space in my talk. That the new paradigm for describing the current turning point is increasingly becoming the new Cold War. But is it a paradigm we can take seriously? And if so, what implications does it have to look at the history of our region and its future through the prism of such paradigm? It is still to be examined. But certainly, this paradigm reopens already now many issues that were considered definitely closed, agreed, settled after 1989. Unfortunately, this paradigm implies also severe challenges rooted in history, especially for Central and Eastern Europe. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has significantly changed the context of the earlier interpretations of the Cold War, meaning the era which started after the Second World War and ended in 1989-1991. It has also renewed interest and reflection on the contemporary influence and legacy of the events which took place during the Cold War, as well as the impact that the end of the Cold War has had on the current situation in international affairs. In any case, this end of the Cold War looks now slightly different in the context of the outbreak of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The recent changes in security policy, which are also a result of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, have led to a revision of the concepts as the post-Cold War era, the post-Cold War order, and finally, the very concept of the Cold War, which were key for our understanding of the last 3 decades in European, transatlantic, and global affairs. Consequently, we can now argue that the war in Ukraine has increased the popularity of such concept as the New Cold War or the Second Cold War, which are widely used in political commentators, media, and academic discourse. Despite some reservations articulated mainly by historians and political scientists, The above concepts are starting to function as keys in explanations of the current crisis in the system of international security. As such, they are used in public debates and the media, where the war in Ukraine is often presented as the starting moment of a new global Cold War. Its outbreak has led to the open questioning of the main principles of the post-Cold War international order and triggered a recrystallization of the division of the world into opposing and competing blocs. The West on the one side and revisionist anti-West powers such as Russia and China and their allies on the other. Ukrainian historian Serhii Płochy has correctly recognized that for many observers of international affairs, I quote, Russia's aggression against Ukraine and the mobilization of the West and its allies to fight that aggression brought back images of the Cold War. Indeed, as Płochy states, the new war revived old animosities, restored flagging alliances, and established old fault lines. The Cold War also provided a language and explanatory frame to describe and understand the new global conflict. However, it is worth to notice that Płochy has some reservation to this vision of the new Cold War. Hence, he argues that, I quote again, there is little doubt, however, that despite numerous parallels with the past, today the world is entering a new era. The peace divided, which came with the end of the Cold War, has been fully spent, if not squandered, over the last 30 years. The world is returning to the era of great power rivalries on a scale unseen since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the end of the quotation. We will need to come later to this ambiguity of the new Cold War concept and the era of the great power rivalries, because it is important, especially from the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe. In principle, the new Cold War paradigm inclines to present the war in Ukraine as the key event in a broader conflict which fits somehow to historical category of Cold War, but is not limited to that, signaling the coming new era of global conflicts. Already 2008, Edward Lucas, the British commentator, in his book on Putin's Russia, has significantly contributed to the revival of the discourse about the relationship between the West and Russia, which is based on references to the Cold War. The title of his book, which has made many editions already, The New Cold War, Putin's Russia and the Threat to the West, has provoked scholarly questions as how justified it is to bring back the old Cold War concept into today's discourse. The internal turn towards authoritarian rule, which Putin had taken, meant a return, at least for Lukács, of the Kremlin's confrontational policy toward the West. And as Lucas notes, in the aftermath of victory in the Cold War, the West's moral stock was high, while the Soviet Union's anti-Westernism seemed a laughable historical relict. But as that period has passed, Russia's public rhetoric has become increasingly caustic. In 2007, Putin denounced America as a pernicious force in world politics. Lucas' valid thesis about the beginning of a new Cold War between Russia and the West was mostly journalistic in style. It attracted a lot of attention, but at the same time created many interpretational challenges. Lucas did not provide a clear definition what he understood as the new Cold War, nor did he theoretically justify the differences and similarities between the new Russia-West rivalry and the old Cold War. He only signaled certain conditions that should be taken into consideration when references to the new concept of the Cold War are made, 2008. That is why, first, the Cold War, in the old meaning of the term, belongs to history and will not come back. That was the opinion of Lucas. That is why any literal comparisons with this period are outdated and erroneous. Secondly, there are some clear differences. Putin's Russia is no longer a global enemy of the West. Again, he wrote it 2008. The clear ideological division between the two worlds, the communist world and the free democratic world, has also disappeared. Nonetheless, the relations between the West and Russia are entering a period of a difficult confrontation, which is something the political and economical elites in the West do not want to accept for different reasons. In Lucas' view, the main mistake made by the West after 1991 was to believe that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was a normal state, one that other countries could engage with economically and politically. Of course, if we are talking about the concept of the new Cold War or the Second Cold War, then from the American standpoint, the current world division and strategic rivalry is more set along the line of US-China relations, while the conflict with Russia is more of a proxy war. In 2021, a few months before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, two political scientists, Hal Brands and John Lewis Gaddis, the author of the Cold War book, published an article in Foreign Affairs titled "The New Cold War, America, China, and the Echoes of History." In it, they argued that even today, today's international context is different than that of the Cold War, the United States and China are nonetheless entering into the phase of their own Cold War. Similarly, historian Niall Ferguson, in an article for the National Review, which was published in 2020, wrote that, I like it, there was a First World War, then there was a second. They were not identical, but they were sufficiently similar for no one to argue about the nomenclatura. Similarly, there was Cold War I, and now we are in Cold War II. Adding in the conclusions that this time it is about China. For a few years now, Ferguson has been consistently arguing about the coming of the new Cold War and presenting it in the context of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The latter he describes as the first not hot war at the time of the new global Cold War, thereby pointing to a striking comparison between the two periods. Additionally, just like after the Second World War, public opinion, just like after the Second World War, public opinion and the political establishment in the West, and especially in the US, needed at least some years and the Korean War to understand that their political community was in the state of the Cold War with Stalinist Russia. Today, after years of self-deception and with the war in Ukraine, the West has finally recognized that Putin's Russia, together with China as its ally, has declared another Cold War against it. In this context, I think it is interesting to listen to another historian, American one, liberal like Ferguson, but with origins in Russia and Poland. I mean Stephen Kotkin, who is going principally, in my opinion, in his interpretations on Russia and West and the war in a similar vein of analogies. Now, regardless of the question of what actually constitutes the epicenter of the events which triggered the process of questioning the post-Cold War world order, the post-Cold World Order, and the process of shaping a new type of order, be it the rivalry and conflict between the United States and China, the Russian-Ukrainian war, or both conflicts together, what draws attention is that the concept of a Cold War, second or new, has started to dominate the terminology used to describe this phenomena. As a result, we are now faced with some fundamental questions that still await serious answers. These questions touch upon the relationship between the old and new Cold War and how, in today's context, we should assess the period of 3 decades of the post-Cold War order in Europe and worldwide. Was this order initially envisioned as transformative, which means it was to be based on fundamental different principles than before? For example, geopolitics were to be abandoned in favor of geoeconomics, ideological and material contradictions were to be abandoned in favor of multilateral global cooperation, and finally, the history of hierarchical state identity was to be replaced by a fluid network of post-modernity in international politics. Was all this only a short and transient episode? Was it a brief break, a state of cold peace after the collapse of the bipolar division of the world before the Second World War started? Or maybe there is some coherent continuity between the old Cold War and the new Cold War. Maybe it is the emerging post-Cold War order and the current new Cold War that together created a fundamentally new yet unrecognized international situation. We describe it increasingly using historical analogies and references to the old Cold War, which is the closest geopolitical experience we have, thereby constructing a sense of continuity and understanding. As stated above, these questions still await serious answers. Now, what was then the Cold War, the old one, in the experience of the Central and Eastern Europeans? Concepts and ideas have practical political consequences. They are not ideals detached from reality and pure thoughts. The same is with the concept of the new Cold War. It has consequences. including the consequences for the historical and political interpretations about the place of Central and Eastern Europe within the European order. Especially if we come to the conclusion that under the pressure of current events, the idea of the post-Cold War order turned out to be a brief and transient period in our history. Philosophically and historically, this undermines the final and ultimate meaning of post-Cold War order, which occurred 35 years ago with all obvious blessings given to the region of Central and Eastern Europe. In order to properly understand the content and consequences of adopting the new Cold War paradigm to describe the position of Central and Eastern Europe, one must first recall what the old Cold War was. In the case of Central and Eastern Europe, the Cold War was something very real, a tangible experience of the generations living in this part of Europe behind the Iron Curtain. However, as one historian rightly pointed out, in conceptual, intellectual, political terms, Cold War was a completely new situation, not least because of the emergence of brand new, previously unknown nuclear weapons of mass destruction. In his 1979 book on the Cold War, this historian, and I mean Ernst Nolte, writes that perhaps no other concept after World War II was so undefined, so unclear, and so controversial, and yet so necessary to describe the situation as precisely the concept of the Cold War. As I mentioned before, Orwell tried to understand this new situation by naming it peace without peace. For Central and Eastern Europe, the Cold War marks the final end of the brief period of its independent existence as a self-contained and self-determined part of Europe between 1918 and, let's say, 1943. During these years, the region existed as a kind of anti-imperial Third Europe. The definition the definite end of this existence was sealed by Washington and London's anti-Hitler alliance with Stalin. So beautifully illustrated in 1943 by Michael Curtis' Hollywood propaganda film Mission to Moscow. You should see the film, based on memoirs of US Ambassador Joseph Davis. This alliance and then the Cold War radically changed the location and understanding of Central and Eastern Europe, which de facto disappeared from the political map of Europe, just as it did in the 19th century. Now, through the Iron Curtain, the bipolar division of Europe into closed blocks, with exception, of course, of Finland, Tito's Yugoslavia, and neutral Austria. Still, the continued existence of this lost region in the era of the Cold War was now claimed rather mostly in a phantom version by such people like Milan Kundera in his essay, A Kidnapped West, The Tragedy of Central Europe, or in more geopolitical terms by authors gathered around the exile magazine Cultura in Paris. Essentially, in the Cold War paradigm, old or new, there is little space or room for the Central and Eastern European region. It is obvious, since the concept of the Cold War was based on the radical division and bipolarity, at least in three fundamental dimensions. These dimensions made it possible to give this undefined, unclear, and controversial and yet so necessary concept of the Cold War as a concrete content. The first dimension is that of the Cold War as principally a West-East conflict. This is essentially how the main message of the Cold War after World War II was understood in Europe. The conflict of West with East and East with West gave the Cold War historical and historiosophical depth. It allowed, for example, to build different historical links and analogies with earlier events from 19th century in Europe. For example, with the period of ideological and political conflict between the Tsarist autocratism of Nicholas I in the 30s and 40s of the 19th century and the tradition of the Western parliamentarism and civil liberties. Also with the first Crimea War between the Russian Empire and Britain and France, or with the still earlier Napoleonic wars against Russia. Historiosophically, the framing of the Cold War as a conflict between the West and East even allowed for much more far-reaching philosophical interpretations that put the conflict of the United States and Western Europe with the Soviet Union in a par with the ancient conflict between the Greeks and the Persians described by Herodotus, as for example Leo Strauss did. All these analogies and interpretations were possible and made sense only if the basic notions of the West and the East were assigned with specific civilizational and ideological meanings. Only if the Cold War division corresponded with an understanding of the division between the civilized and barbaric worlds, between the world of democracy and freedom on the one hand and the world of tyranny on the other. However, it should be also here added that the creation of the Soviet state as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution and then the final recognition of the state by the United States in 1933 seriously complicated such a civilizational and ideological understanding of the division of the world. Although Tsarist Russia, like the Ottoman Empire, could be treated as a relict of the Eastern despotic and Asian barbarism, for example, the rise of Soviet state complicated this situation greatly. The Leninist Soviet, which was built on the Western idea of Marxism, obviously in its Leninist formula, but still founded on the claims to genuine modernity, progress, liberation from class and national oppression, and the right of nations to the self-determination. This state was becoming for many a legitimate alternative for the civilized West. The second dimension of the Cold War is fundamentally geopolitical. However, it is essential to understand geopolitics here not in the sense of the Munich School of Geopolitics, led by Karl Haushofer, but rather in the British tradition of thought from Halford John Mackinder. According to him, the Cold War became, after World War II, an inevitable consequence of the emergence of the world as a one single system, in which certain geographical laws push states and powers toward competition and confrontation. At its core, this was a conflict over the consolidation of power by a hegemon within the primary geopolitical entity that Mackinder identified for the global system in his famous essay, The Geographical Pivot of History, namely Eurasia. The danger of such consolidation, especially from the perspective of the United States, Western Europe, and obviously from the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe, was principally related to Soviet Russia in the 20th century, particularly to its relations with Germany on one side and China on the other. In any case, such consolidation, which required the vast resources and capabilities, and the Soviet and especially Stalinist system of power, was seen as a mortal threat to both Europe and America. However, with the World War II, Mackinder identified a second key geopolitical entity in the global system, which he called the Midland Ocean in 1943, essentially referring to the transatlantic war. The Cold War was thus established on these geopolitical mechanisms of conflict between two main entities of the global system, Eurasia and Midland Ocean. In this collision, Central and Eastern Europe became the critical seismic zone of geopolitical rivalry. The third dimension that gave the concept of the Cold War its concrete substance is the ideological conflict. As I mentioned before, this conflict significantly complicated the traditional division between East and West, which had previously been framed in civilizational or ideological terms. Here we are talking about the role and significance of the so-called armed ideologies of the 20th century, each of which claimed, whether more or less justifiably, to represent the ultimate universal model of social, economic, and political modernity. These ideologies also encapsulated enormous revolutionary, emancipatory, and liberating potential for all of humanity, which was to be finally liberated from the forms of oppression and enslavement as defined by each of both ideologies. For the communists, this oppression came from imperialist capitalism and colonialism, while from the viewpoint of Western liberalism, it was the oppression of communist despotism. As a result of the Cold War, America, according to this ideological division, became the arsenal for the wars of democracy and freedom, as President Truman declared in his 1947 speech to Congress, while the Soviet Union became the arsenal of global communism, as Stalin asserted in his so-called election speech of 1946, which, by the way, inspired Kennan to alarm Washington and write his long telegram. This ideological confrontation between liberalism and communism represented more than just geopolitical rivalry. It embodied competing visions of the future of humanity, each offering a radically different path to liberation. As a result, the Cold War became not only a struggle for global influence, but also a battleground for the ideological and moral leadership in the world. The shared context of World War II and the defeat through alliance of the third ideological alternative of the 20th century, Nazism and fascism, was also significant for both ideologies. As a result of this context, during the Cold War, the Soviets sought to ideologically portray the West as essentially an imperialist power and a continuation of Nazism and fascism, against which Soviet communism, inherently anti-fascist, continued a deadly struggle. On the other hand, in the realities of the early Cold War, the West emphasized the systemic similarities and connections between the totalitarianism of Nazis in Germany and communism in Russia. Hence, it is important to note that ideologically, the nations of Central and Eastern Europe found themselves, in a consequence of the Cold War, in a unique ideological triangle imposed of three core concepts: liberalism, anti-fascism, and communism. As Juliusz Mieroszewski from Kultura, Polish exile magazine in Paris, noted in one of his 1964 writings, the Cold War confronted Central and Eastern Europe not only with fundamental geopolitical challenges, but also with geo-ideological challenges. What are the consequences if we look at the Cold War in that way, through the prism of these three main dimensions? What are now the consequences of the return of the Cold War concept, new or second, especially from the perspective of our region? So, looking from the perspective of these three dimensions of the Cold War, we can attempt to make a few comments on the consequences of adopting the Cold War paradigm, whether new or second, for describing current events and the situation of Central and Eastern Europe. The return of the Cold War idea, particularly in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war, may be perceived as a strong preference for politicians and commentators both in America and Russia. The Cold War framework allows to re-establish themselves in familiar roles. On the Russian side, it reinforces the increasingly influential suspicion growing since the Kosovo War in late 90s of the 20th century, that the West never truly ended the Cold War against Russia, but continued it through other means and in other arenas, essentially uninterrupted since the war in Bosnia. This is a very popular Putin's narrative, as you well know. For America, the return to a Cold War mindset is advantageous because it allows the US to reclaim its own dominant position, perhaps now somehow diminishing, and to draw on the legacy of events that ultimately culminated in the West Great victory with the fall of Soviet Union. However, if this is the case, then the consequences of adopting the Cold War paradigm, whether new or second, go much further. First and foremost, this paradigm forces us to reconsider and reassess the end of the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. Its transformational, final, and universal character is called into question. Hence, we are still now in the situation described by Orwell in 1945 as a peace that is not peace. The Cold War provided Europe and the world with a structure of order and international stabilization after the war, albeit at the costs of the freedom behind the Iron Curtain and the tragedies of regional conflicts, the so-called proxy wars, but it did not bring the peace. War continued, by other means becoming a permanent and never-ending reality. The old Westphalian logic, the logic of the jus publicum Europaeum, which politicians and diplomats still adhered to after World War I, according to which there is a time of war ended by a peace treaty and then a time of peace, this logic came to an end. Is it gone forever? Here we can see the true significance of the hope and enthusiasm accompanying the events of 1989-1991 in Europe, which revived the belief that war, specifically the Cold War, does not have to be a permanent and ultimate state of affairs, and that it is possible to achieve a state of peace, real peace. This peace would not only be peace in the old classical sense, but something more, a transformative peace, leading us into a completely new era of politics and international relations. However, if we are indeed returning to the Cold War paradigm, whether new or second, all of this must be seriously reconsidered and revised. This includes, for example, such beliefs that the current war in Ukraine is being fought in order to give Ukraine chance to follow the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that after 1989 embarked on the path of liberal Western transformation. If we return now to the Cold War paradigm, we must also, especially in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, return to all those fundamentals that defined the content of the old Cold War. We must consistently return, taking into account all the new conditions we face in the 21st century, to the issue of the East-West conflict in its civilizational and ideological meaning, as a conflict between two irreconcilable ways of life. We must revisit the determinism of grand geopolitics, which nowadays are once again dominating minds of many, and confront them anew. Finally, despite the declared end of grand ideologies, we must return to the world of ideologies, or rather their facades, created by leaders to meet the needs of the moment and reflect on their real content and significance. Coming to conclusion. For Central and Eastern Europe, the return of the Cold War paradigm is a great and severe challenge, as it once again places the region at the center of a great systemic divisions and conflicts over which it may have little or no influence. Will the concept of a new or second Cold War consequently lead to the renewed reduction and marginalization of this region? Will it again divide it into two parts in line with the logic of great systemic conflicts over which the nations living in the region will have no control? Will we once again see another Iron Curtain separating the frontline countries from those possibly sacrificed in the name of the greater good of international stability? In the above quotation from Sergei Płochy's book on the Russian-Ukrainian war, I have already mentioned, I hear a tune of clear anxiety over how eagerly and even with a sort of intellectual excitement some American and British historians, using today the paradigm of a new or second Cold War, engage in discussions of historical analogies. This seems, in my view, as if they are trying to erase the unpleasant impression left by the recent excitements over the end of history. Płochy writes, not by accident, that besides of old analogies to Cold War, the world is returning to the era of a great power rivalries on a scale unseen since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And this remark relates more, in my opinion, to the deep-seated experience in Central and Eastern Europe of nations struggling for freedom, for independence from empires, and for their own place in the continent, regardless of geopolitical and ideological determinants. And I believe that it is worth examining carefully the concept of a second or new Cold War today, precisely because, like the old concept of the Cold War, it is so undefined and controversial, and yet it seems to many indispensable in describing the current situation. From the perspective of our region, however, it poses very serious challenges. It also has another value. It shows that without rethinking the significance of the Cold War era and its end, which has supposed to mark the beginning of entirely new post-Cold War times, will not be able to understand entirely our contemporary times. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are still within our schedule, so now we can go directly upstairs and where we are going to have simultaneous sessions, and then we meet at the coffee break, and at the 4 p.m. we gather here at the panel that is going to be about the empires and imperialism. It is going to be led by the Professor Andrzej Nowak from Polish Instytut of History of the Polish Academy of Sciences. So please go upstairs, and we are going to start the sessions immediately.
And we are finally reaching the main point of our today's conference, which will be the session, the panel discussion led by Professor Andrzej Nowak. And I don't think I need to introduce Professor Andrzej Nowak. He's a very well-known scholar, historian, and public intellectual here in Poland. But for those who are from abroad, I would like to say that he's professor of historian dealing with, especially with Russia, with Polish-Russian relations. He's a professor of Jagiellonian University in Kraków, and he's also a professor at Polish Academy of Science, the Institute of History. And Professor Nowak will introduce our other guests. And I will just pass the voice to Professor, but I just wanted to mention that we are going to make a photo from all of you if you want to join us after this session, before the reception. So please stay with us after the discussion finishes, and we'll make a group photo. So the discussion will take 1.5 hours. Professor Nowak will open the discussion also for you, so please prepare your questions during the discussion and enjoy. Professor Nowak, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for organizing this conference, debating such an important topic. And I would like to thank you as well for inviting many so well-known important scholars from different countries. Here I want to thank especially guests of this panel, or rather participants of this panel, maybe starting from Professor Dariusz Staliunas, really leading specialist in academic world as regards studies of Russian Empire in the 19th century and different, especially ethnic aspects, modern making. This kind of topics were presented in many of his monographies, as well as a bit more contemporary questions concerning Holocaust taking place in what Timothy Snyder called bloodlands. So thanking once again Professor Staliunas for coming to us. I want to introduce other participants. Professor Jan Holzer, also world-known specialist, but from a different discipline, that is from political science, dealing in his monographies synthesis with comparative history of especially 20th century Soviet, I would say, imperial experiment, how it is analyzed from a political science perspective, from the point of view of studying non-democratic regimes. In this field, Professor Holzer produced, if I may use this word, awkward word, many very important insights, both in his books and in collections of articles he published in top Western publishers. And finally, going to representative of Polish historians, Professor Marek Kornat from Instytut of History, Polish Academy of Sciences, as well as from University, Catholic University of Cardinal Wyszyński here in Warsaw. He's probably the best specialist in Polish historiography now as regards history of diplomatic relations, especially in the first half of the 20th century, but also besides of his very many fundamental publications in this field, I want to mention just one of the latest very important political biography of Józef Beck, published together with Professor Mariusz Wołos. Professor Kornat also published many important studies regarding, so to speak, reflection on the phenomenon, on the I would say, realizing phenomenon of totalitarianism, both in the forms of Soviet, I would say, experiment and totalitarianism also in its German version, so to speak, German Nazi version. So having this unique occasion of presenting three different points of view on one important subject, that is studies of Russian and communist, I would say, imperialism as it developed throughout the 20th century. I want to mention also that I am very pleased to recommend a book that was just published a week ago, in which all these three authors opened this book with their important texts. The book realizes the beginning of a larger project that is based in Instytut of History, Polish Academy of Sciences, but it is international project in essence, studying forms and metamorphoses of Russian Soviet imperialisms, Russian imperialisms, starting from times of Peter I, that is the end of 17th century, all the way down to this year actually, to contemporary times. And this book is one of many that are prepared by this project. So this is for the introduction. Sorry, maybe it was a bit too long, but I want to give the floor especially to our specialist. To make short my introduction, I want just to remind that it is now almost 41 years since American President Ronald Reagan used the term evil empire to describe Soviet Union. At that time, I mean, this particular name given to Soviet Union was considered totally unscientific. It was criticized by academics also in the West, not just by propagandists here in sorry, on this side of the wall of the Iron Curtain. But not only through this link between moral judgment and a very specific term, institutional term, evil empire, but due to something that is of our interest here, that is of using the very term empire. At that time, that is in the beginning of 80s, predominantly or exclusively emigres from, I would say, Warsaw Pact countries used this term to describe Soviet Union and its essence, political essence, while the mainstream, academic mainstream in the West rather avoided that term as somehow outdated or unfit to describe Soviet phenomenon. Yet, since the times that came very quickly after Ronald Reagan declared this particular notion to be an important description of the Soviet Union, with the crisis of the Soviet Union, that is in the second half of 80s, the term of empire began to come back, so to speak, to the studies, to scholar studies of Soviet phenomenon. And this is exactly the starting point for our reflection. I would like that we compare throughout our discussion different stages of growth, of development, of changes in the studies of Russian Soviet empire, imperialism, but also of the communist phenomenon as seen from political science perspective, from Russian imperial studies, especially 19th century, which Professor Staliunas, I'm sure, would develop, and from the international relations and diplomatic history perspective, which probably Professor Kornat would like to take as his starting point. So my first question would be, what changes in the study of empires, and in particular the Russian Empire, have taken place since 1990? And here I want to make just one quick caveat. Please develop your reflections on the subject, stopping at the moment of 2022 or even 2014, because this would be caesura I want to introduce for the second question. So between 1990 and, let's say, the second decade of the 21st century. If, I don't know who would be the first. Okay, let's Darius be the first.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good evening, I think, already, and thank you for an invitation and kind introduction. I think I will start by complicating things even more, because what historians usually do, they complicate things, which seems to be obvious. And I will start with the term that Andrzej described shortly, namely empire. There is a very famous and influential Lithuanian historian who wrote a very solid book about the Grand Duchy of Lithuania as an empire. President Barroso of the European Commission once called European Union as anti-imperial empire. I think many political scholars would call the United States as empire, and I guess most of the audience here today would agree that the current Russian state is also an empire. If we look back to the history, to the 19th century, then we have at least two different kinds of empires. The Austro-Hungary with its policy of compromises, and the Tsarist Empire or Romanov Empire or Russian Empire, whatever you call it, with its policy of repressions, persecutions, etc. So the term itself as analytical term is very complicated, and I think we have to agree first of all what we understand under this term. And I think there might be two strategies or two directions how we deal with this problem. The one is to concentrate on external policies, and here, at least in my field, I would mention Dominique Lieven, who says that empire is first and foremost a great power. So, I mean, geopolitics plays the main role in these definitions. And another representative would be Ronald Suni, and I know that Andrzej Nowak has an opinion about his latest book, but maybe it's not the place to discuss it now. So Ron Suni and many others concentrate on internal structures, and they emphasize that empires, political structures based on hierarchical relations of power, and its form of rule is exercised through difference rather than through integration and assimilation. And since my own research is mainly based on internal policies, on what I usually call nationality policy of the Tsarist Empire. So my next arguments will be related to this aspect of empire, not to imperialism seen as expansion towards other countries, but more towards how the empire is ruled, how the multi-ethnic borderlands are managed by the Russian state. And if we look at the scholarship until 1990 and afterwards, we would see a huge differences, a sea change actually, because almost up until 1990, all the histories of Russia of that period was very Russocentric. And if there were some exceptions, then they usually were represented by emigres, and not ethnic Russian emigres, but by Baltic Germans, by Poles, and others who are kind of represented non-dominant ethnic groups of the Tsarist Empire. And then with geopolitical changes, also some new trends appeared in the scholarship, and I think two names should be mentioned here, Edward Theiden and Andreas Kappeler. And from that point, I think, and especially in the last 3 decades, we can talk about imperial turn. So about many new innovations that were, I would say, very productive. There were some problems with that, but maybe I'll come to these problems when we discuss next questions. But I would like to stress a couple of positive innovations that I see in the last 3 decades in the research on the Russian Empire. So the first one is that we have now quite a many publications on Russian Empire as nationalizing state. Usually we had two antithetical concepts of empire, that is ruled by differentiation, and nation state that tries to assimilate, nationalize and suppress on ethnicities. And now there is a huge literature that shows that a lot of these policies of nationalization was already visible in late imperial periods, at least from 1830s and even in the second half of the 19th century. And I would argue that the literature that we have now and the knowledge that we collected in recent decades may even allow us to argue that Russian Empire was even much more nationalizing state as the interwar Poland and Lithuania, not to mention Latvia and Estonia. So I think that it's quite an interesting trend that at least I see. The next positive innovation, I would say, was that we started to differentiate the term and the concept and the policies that were usually called Russification. And to simplify things a little bit, we see that under this term that was widely used early, and it's actually widely used now, very different policies were introduced by the Tsarist government. With regard to the Polish and Jewish people, there was a policy of segregation, while in some other cases, that policy could be described even as ethnocide. Like in the case of Ukrainians and Belarusians, at least in some periods of time. So, and when all these policies used to call Russification, I mean, it's just a useless term that says nothing. And my last point about positive innovations within that new imperial turn would be about the literature that is devoted to what is usually called mental mapping. There are now some publications that clearly show that the geo-images that were typical for the imperial ruling and intellectual elite had two concepts of Russia. One of them was Russia as an empire, and another concept was as Russia of a kind of Russian national territory. And this differentiation between these two geo-images, I think, helps us a lot to explain differences in nationality policy in the Tsarist period. So these were positive trends, and I hope I will have time later to discuss problems that I see within that imperial term. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very succinct analysis of the main trends in what is called sometimes new imperiology. Before I will pass the floor to Professor Holzer and the perspective of political science, I want just to comment that it is interesting how the hidden question of moral judgment or moral valuing of the phenomena that are studied by historians as well is still with us. Because when I started with this term evil empire, it is evident that for those who use the term Russification indiscriminately, it usually means something bad, something maybe even evil. And those who try to differentiate tries to distance from this moral judging, not always of course, but this, I would say, clash of sensibilities concerning imperial politics is still with us. And of course I am part of it, probably like many other historians. And that's why we took the subject, because of course the very fact of Russian open invasion against Ukraine stresses this aspect of, I would say, moral assessment of different types of imperial politics, also in its internal, I would say, dimension. But this I am just mentioning in order to so to speak, ignite further discussion. So sorry, Darius, I hope you will forgive me this this commentary from a side. Now, again, more scholarly voice from Professor Holzer.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, of course, for the kind invitation and the possibility to take part in this conference. I would say my approach to the problem of concept of imperialism was a little bit different. So comparing, for instance, the Darius approach. So as Professor Andrzej said, so having political science maybe background. So from me, quite interesting was the question. So what role played and maybe will play the concept of imperialism from the point of view of general classification of non-democratic regimes, or even in the classification of political regime in general. So so that's of course my field of interest, and from this point of view, such question looked for me simply attractive, simply sexy. If I can use such word, of course. Sorry. What does it mean? So, and maybe no secrets. So we can start to call the murder. So it played not very significant role, I would say so. And why? I would like to explain why and what's the context of such situation, which is of course possible to divide from the point of view of development of debate on non-democratic regimes before 1989 and after. So, of course, very briefly. So, starting from this golden age of the discussions about the non-democratic regimes, first of all, of course, the concept of totalitarianism. So it's very interesting that this concept of imperialism is really mentioned very very rare, and to identify really the maybe significant role in the classical textbook on these issues is quite difficult task. So of course, for instance, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Karl Joachim Friedrich mentioned imperialism as something what is quite important, but generally speaking, I would say that really this concept is not very often mentioned in such text, articles, books, etc. Yeah? I think that the reason is quite visible. It's the reason sounded that imperialism was elaborated first of all as the concept which is the part of the Western legacy. So, and I think that this story is quite well known. Because comparing the empirical data and comparing the countries and political regimes, cases of political regimes which are background for the creation of the concept of totalitarianism. So it's necessary to say that there's the role of Bolshevik regime and the data from Soviet development after 1917, so that these data were not very significant from the point of view of this totalitarian debate. So, and these authors like Arendt, Brzezinski and Friedrich Neumann and many others, Jacob Telmon and many others, simply concentrated on the situation concerning the development in fascist Italy, in the Nazi Germany, etc., etc. So, and so there is one quite significant and interesting turn point. There are the publications, articles from American political scientist Jean Kirkpatrick in the end of the 70s and at the beginning of 80s, and she tried to involve the concept of imperialism, maybe in a little bit another words, in another vocabulary, in the sense of the need to export, to expand, or something like this, into the classification of non-democratic political regimes. It was, of course, the response to the classical text by J.J. Linz, Juan Jose Linz, at the beginning of 70s, who formulated and conceptualized the concept of authoritarianism in the difference in the comparison with the totalitarianism, and this difference to this need to expand and typical for totalitarian regimes, and on the other hand, this concentration to the home mentality without any such need, typical for authoritarianism. It was something that was very crucial, I would say. The second point, which is from my point of view interesting in this debate, is this weakness of concept of totalitarianism during the 70s and 80s. So it's necessary to point out and remind that the Western academic community prefer this revisionist approaches to this data, and the concept of totalitarianism was called as the propagandistic effect of Cold War debate, public debate, which is totally how it is in English? Unusable, thank you very much, from the point of view of academic production, etc., etc. So the books by Sheila Fitzpatrick are, of course, well known in this context. So that's the situation before 1989. And very briefly talking about the situation in the last 3 decades. So of course the situation in this debate a little bit changed. So what is maybe continuing in this situation is this lack of the concept of totalitarianism in the general conceptualization and classification of political regimes. So try to, for instance, to follow various indexes of political regimes, starting from Freedom House, varieties of democracy, PolitiPress, etc., and very typically concept or maybe type of political regime called totalitarianism is missing in this vocabulary. And the final highest non-democratic type is authoritarianism, or maybe closed authoritarianism, or classical authoritarianism, or something like this. So it is, of course, problem from the point of view of this involving of the problem of expansionism and imperialism into the methodological approaches, how to study such regimes. And of course, it's continued during the last decade in the 20th century and at the beginning of 21st century. Generally speaking, the debate on non-democratic regimes was very weak in this period. It looked only as the task and the problem only for historians. I am very sorry. So for political scientists, so that's simply that issue. Comparative political science community concentrated on the problem of democratization studies, etc., etc. That was the situation approximately 2-3 decades ago. Something, of course, changed at the beginning of 21st century. Now we are deeply in the debate on the crisis of liberal democratic regimes, where the so-called modern or new authoritarianism this concept plays the role of the oppositional type standing against the liberal democratic regimes. But maybe searching for the place of concept of imperialism in these debates, so you will have the problem to identify any real involving of any ability or maybe willingness. That's the question, of course. Ability or willingness to incorporate in these debates. So a little bit paradoxical framework for this development was, of course, the last final in this moment democratization paradigm, so-called democracy promotion paradigm, which emerged at the beginning of 21st century and was really quite strong concepts how to think about the democratization in the world, where some values like spreading of democratic rule of law and a liberal, of course, values, interest, procedures, mechanisms, etc., was very, very typical. So this paradigm is in this moment totally dead. After the Arab Spring, nobody is able or willing to publish some text with such theoretical background, of course, and the reasons are quite very visible for us, and are maybe reasons why we are in this moment here. So that's of course the change of geopolitical situation in the region of Eastern Europe. That's my picture. Maybe longer that was necessary, but sorry.
Thank you so much. I made a few notes to start another round of discussion, but before I will go to that, I want to give the floor to Professor Marek Kornat.
Thank you very much, Professor Nowak. Thank you for kind introduction to our session and presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can generally specify three very positive, in my opinion, of course, tendencies, phenomena in the Sovietology or Russian studies, Sovietology and Russian studies after the collapse of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, first of all, the renaissance of the imperial studies. It was mentioned by Professor Staliunas in his brief statement today. the return to this old term empire, it is very significant change which was produced by the collapse of the Soviet state. And in my opinion, it is very significant, it is important for the development of Sovietology, especially in the West, however, also in Poland, of course. This is one point. I will limit to the enumeration of the principal points in my short reflections. Secondly, I think the most important was the inclusion of the Soviet Union to the studies of to the genocide studies, especially I mean the reflection on Ukrainian Holodomor or Soviet forced collectivization of villages, etc. And thirdly, I think we can show the very important example. It was the Cold History project, Cold War History project, sorry. It was probably the most important achievement in the post-Cold War Sovietology in the West. I think it is the third very important point in my presentation. And we have also dangerous tendencies, in my opinion, and I will respond to the words of Professor Holzer. I mean the tendency, it is visible in the West, not in Poland, but in the West, the tendency to eliminate the term of totalitarianism in the Sovietology, in the studies on non-democratic regimes. And this term is seen as a product of Cold War. It should be eliminated, and it should be replaced by the theory of different dictatorships. It is very dangerous, especially in German political science and in historiography in Germany, because speaking from this point of view, we have many dictatorships in Poland, in Turkey, in Spain, in the Soviet Union, in Italy, in Germany, etc. They were absolutely incomparable, and it allowed to neglect the uniqueness of the Soviet totalitarianism, the first totalitarianism in the 20th century history. And second, not positive factor, it is the continuity, in my opinion, the continuity of the historical reflection on the Soviet foreign policy in the interwar era, and especially in the circumstances of the outbreak of the Second World War. In my opinion, that in the West, it is generally a tendency to see the Soviet Union as a peaceful, passive actor of the international politics in this time, in the interwar era. It is not true, of course, because this was the expansionist empire, of course, and it is of course a different point of view in Polish historiography and in the historiography of our region of Europe and in the West, of course. But the tendency to show the Soviet Union as a passive and rather peaceful actor of the international politics is still in course. I think that it should be observed that it is dangerous, in my opinion, tendency in the Sovietology. Actually, of course, we can, of course, believe that the war against Ukraine should help in the change of this situation, but in my opinion, we have rather continuity of the revisionist school in the speaking of Soviet foreign policy. Of course, the tendency to eliminate the notion of totalitarianism is also a sort of continuity of the revisionist vision of the Soviet Union, which tried to replace the totalitarian school, of course. And I think that will be all for this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these three important and synthetical insights into changes of our disciplines. Because we are very much pressed by time, I want to sum up what I plan. That is one next round concerning any observable changes in the field you describe, emanating from simply, I would say, geostrategic and to a degree also moral change connected with the recent aggression and its two stages, 2014 and 2022. And the last round, which I would like to also introduce now very briefly, is to think about perspectives concerning sources of imperial conduct, to put it with the words of Adam Ulam. Then the final part of our panel would be open floor for the questions from the public or commentaries. Going quickly to the next round, I already defined the subject. Do you see any changes, consequences of the new stage of Russian aggression against Ukraine, or maybe before? Were there any effects of the first aggression, military aggression made against Georgia already 16 years ago, or just only this last stage from 2022 produced any observable new tendencies in the field you follow so closely? I don't know, maybe Darius again would start.
Okay. Maybe I'll start with very politically incorrect remark or bad joke, I don't know. I think there's one group that is the winner of the Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2014 and 2022, and that group is historians, because history now matters. But as I said, it's bad joke. We would all prefer to be in the normal times and less attention to history and less attention to what we are doing. I think there are some positive trends in scholarship. Some started in after the Russian occupation of Crimea, some just 2 years ago. And I mean here a lot of discussions about decolonization of East European studies. Whatever you mean by that, for me it's first of all is a kind of trend away from Russocentrism, although that might bring us, put us into new traps. I think there's much more attention to terminology we use, starting with very simple things like place names and going into much more complicated issues. The one more thing that got more attention is mental maps, what we mean by Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, borderlands, transfer regions, etc., that we should reflect on it much more. And last but not least, I mean, this is very telegraphic list of positive trends. And last but not least, I think there are some institutional changes, at least in some countries. As far as I know, there are very important new developments in Germany with two quite strong centers for Ukrainian studies in Regensburg and Viadrina University. And you can see also these trends in some other European states. I'm not sure about the United States, but maybe here my knowledge is just too limited. But still there are some problems, and some of them became even stronger represented in scholarship, because even after 2014 we see a kind of opposite trend to what Western scholars usually call methodological nationalism. I would say there is a lot of scholarship that could be described as methodological imperialism, when just scholars are reproducing imperial narratives and presenting them as an academic analysis. And there's also, for example, ignorance of the consequences of Russian policy in the 19th century. Just one example, some of you might know the journal, which is also open access, Russian Global Affairs. Already after the beginning of the war, there was an article by a very influential historian about the competition of two national ideas, Ukrainian and Russian in Ukraine, as if it was a kind of free market competition, as if there was no repressive policy from the Tsarist government, etc. I think these are kind of dangerous trends, and there are some other problems that I see and that should be solved in a scholarship, but maybe I stop here.
Thank you so much. Now I am going quickly to Professor Holzer.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I cannot share the enthusiasm of Darius as for the reputation of historians, because I think that there is no influence for the reputation of political scientists. It is so bad as was. But concerning the question of Andrei, so I think that what changed. So I will not concentrate on the situation in the academia, in the academic community, but what is very important from the point of view of political science and theory of political science theories. So it is the reconstruction of the maybe roles in the Western communities, in Western societies, as for the identification of supporters of Russian politics. So it is very interesting and of course very important developments. So we know very well that the ideological context of the support for the Soviet project before 1999. So that was the leftist part of the an ideological camps in Western communities. Now the situation changed. So and it's more oriented to the conservative maybe argumentation. Which is, of course, a great mistake from the point of view of classical conservative approaches. This belief, this thesis that the Putin regime is conservative, and so it's ideological background, etc. So that's from the point of view of political science, I think, very visible, important, and remarkable change.
Thank you so much, Marek.
Thank you. I think that it is very short time since 2022. It's only nearly 3 years, and it is very difficult to estimate the real impact of this war on historiography, on Sovietology, on Russian studies, etc. For actually, in our days, the war is not lasted. The war will be ended, but it's difficult to say in which time. I think that one need is actually in the field of Sovietology and Russian studies. This is the need to return to the school of historical continuity of Russian empire, of expansionist and autocratic Russia. And this school requires re-examination and requires new study. We can say that the founding father of this conception was Jan Kucharzewski, but we have many other prominent figures in historiography of this way of thinking. I mean, especially the best known is probably Professor Richard Pipes, but this school of historical continuity of Russia is absolutely necessary to be returned and re-examined. One argument, it is absolutely difficult to divide what is Russian and what is Soviet in contemporary Russia. And in this perspective, the idea of Kucharzewski and Pipes seems me very, very inspiring. And that's all for this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I will start the last round, just one remark. Of course, it is very risky and yes, maybe premature to ask the question about consequences of the war that started in its new very hot phases just 2.5 years ago. Nevertheless, bearing in mind this warning by Zhou Enlai when asked, I don't know, maybe 50 years ago about assessment of the French Revolution, which happened 180 years before he was asked, he answered, it's far too early to assess. So I understand that it is far too early to assess where we are in this current of historical changes. Nevertheless, we are tempted to ask these questions because this open aggression seems to me an important point, caesura. How important and how lasting, this is really difficult to say. But this is caesura important enough exactly to renew the question you posed about the value of this old school, very old school, initiated by Jan Kucharzewski, continued by Richard Pipes to a degree and other historians as well. But it leads to maybe more general question. The last question which I want to post as the last round, that is, what are sources of imperialist action and what are sources of imperialism legitimacy, both inside, that is, here we mean Russian society, contemporary Russian society, and outside. Here I can mention, for example, so-called realist school in the United States, but also very much present in Western Europe, sometimes also even in Poland, that simply accepts as a data of geopolitical realities imperial expansion and imperial zones of influences as something given that cannot be eliminated from foreseeable future. So here I want to ask you this particular, maybe non-historical, but rather prognostic question. It is difficult to ask such a question, but you can base that, of course, in your scholarship dealing with legitimacy of imperial regimes and how they are assessed, for example, from Darius' perspective, both on part of, let's say, national project in the making, like Lithuanian, Ukrainian, or Jewish or Polish in the 19th century I mean, legitimacy of imperialism from that perspective, and of course, legitimacy of imperialism from Russian perspective, national or nationalizing Russian perspective. So this is one of many possible points of view on the question which I posed and which I just suggest to you, but you may of course select your own starting point. If you could start.
Okay, before I shortly answer your last question, I have two comments on our previous discussion. And the first one is also more like a joke about moral judgment. I mean, if we concentrate on moral judgments, we might all lose our jobs, because then, I mean, anyone from the street might come in and say that our moral judgment is misleading and they know better, so for what reason they would need an expertise of historians. My second comment is where it's too early to discuss the impact of ongoing war. I think it's too late, in a sense that when we discuss these issues, we might also make a kind of impact on what is going on, because these discussions is also about changes. I mean, if we stay silent, then nothing will change. So, I mean, this discussion and many other discussions is just very small impact or possible impact on the changes that are needed. And now answering your question about the sources, I mean, I think I would need more time to think about this issue, but of course, when dealing with the 19th century and specifically with that period, of course, the authoritarian tradition that lasted for centuries was an important aspect, but there's one more, I think, interesting case, and here I have in mind the Jewish question. The Jews were, in Russia, were the last or the second last national group that was emancipated. I mean, comparing with their fellow nationals in other states of the 19th century, the only state where Jews were not emancipated in the 19th century, as far as I know, was Romania. How come? And I think that the simplest explanation to that is that there were no real revolutions in the 19th century Russia, and Russia didn't lose any serious war, except for some smaller wars that were not in the core of the empire, but somewhere in the borderlands, like the Crimean War and Russo-Japanese War. So without these two important components, there were no reforms, important reforms with the emancipation of Jews, and now you can think about consequences for current situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You know, I think that the question concerning the legitimacy, the legitimation, is really crucial in this debate, and from the point of view of our ability to, I don't want to say forecast, but to understand the development, and maybe to think about the coming events. So what is important from my point of view, so you know, this concept of legitimacy and development of this debate looked very strange so in last decades. So after 1999, so the approach where the non-democratic regimes were the regimes without any legitimacy. So it looked really very black-white. It means that the only legitimate regime with legitimacy was the democratic one, and non-democratic regimes were out of this debate. So and it was necessary. That's the development in last maybe 10, 12 years. Some articles were published by by Johann Gershevsky, Ivan Krastev, Tyler Rowlands, where the legitimacy was involved once again into the debate. Ivan Krastev in Journal of Democracy published text where he defended the thesis that authoritarianism can be authoritarianism can be creative, can be friendly. Yes, that's the word. So can be friendly. So some non-democratic regimes are interesting, attractive for some parts of the some social groups, some social structures, institutions, etc., etc. So from this point of view, I think that we are in the situation where it's necessary to once again to reassess this problem. So that's the development why the concept of resilience is in security studies and in political science so strong and so intensively debated. So from this point of view, we are in this situation, new thinking about how and why is something, some type of rules, sometimes of values, etc., attractive from some actors in the game, including regimes like Russia, for instance. Thank you.
For me, yes. I think that we have many sources of Soviet imperialism, but I will try to limit myself to 3 of them. First of all, I think that it is Russia's past. Russia was empire. Russia wants to be empire now and in the future, and she does not imagine any kind of functioning in the international relations without having empire. This is my point of view on this question. Secondly, I think that the next source, it is the anti-Western mind, anti-Western healing, which is enrooted in Russia's history. In Russia's history, and the Soviet Union also was the period of rather continuity of this mind than any rupture. Soviet times were a new phase, a new etap of this tradition only. And third source, it is the geopolitics, in my opinion. Russia wants to have political control on Eastern and Central Europe. Any rebuilding of the geopolitical architecture of Eastern Europe is absolutely against her. Russia lost, of course, the control on Warsaw Pact, former Warsaw Pact countries, on Baltic states, of course, and now the emancipation of potential emancipation of Ukraine, potential victorious war against Russia is absolutely a blow from the Russian perspective. I will try to remind us the words of Professor Zbigniew Brzeziński. Professor Zbigniew Brzeziński said that without Ukraine, Russia is not a first-rank power, and this is the main reason, I think, of the political thought of actual Russia in this time. Who controls the Central and Eastern Europe, controls especially Eurasia, and these thesis of Halford Mackinder, I think, is describing the realities, geopolitical realities, which should be taken into account when we are speaking now on Russian expansionism and Russian Russian methods of conquer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we start the last round, that is the round in which all the public is invited to introduce your questions, your commentaries, I want to make my own very short commentary based on this exchange of opinions. It seemed to me interesting that this divide, the West and our perspective, was on some occasions reflected in our debate. Not in all voices, of course, but on some occasions. And this reminds me, the West do not understand everything. The West rejected, the Western scholars, the term totalitarianism, and so on and so forth. This just to remind the examples, the echoes of that attitude. And I think there is also an interesting key to one of possible answers to legitimacy of imperialism. In Russia, for example, that is longing for agency, for collective agency, because the West was perceived from the Russian perspective, as was reminded both by Darius and by Marek, by Professor Kornat, was from times immemorial, that is from the beginning of Muscovy as the new form of state, seen as the enemy in that tradition, but at the same time with developing this ideology closer to our times in, let's say, Nicholas Danilevsky works in the middle, second half of 19th century, through Lenin, imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. It was evident that this concept is taken Russia as anti-imperial empire, exactly as the EU was defined by José Manuel Barroso. We fight against the real empires that are there in the West. They try to subjugate us. They try to control us. They make us victims. And this gives exactly the legitimacy that we are regaining our collective, so to speak, agency. And there is, I would say, an interesting juncture between this, I would say, academic narrative imperialism to a degree that defines some means of and terminology of interpreting different phenomena, and somehow produces its only reflections in less powerful, I would say, academic centers. This creates exactly a similar reaction that we observe on the political level, which also makes room for this part, at least, of legitimacy of imperial building in Russia, or rebuilding in Russia. So this is something for me to reflect. Maybe you find a completely different aspects of our discussion that would ignite your own reflection. So this is time to give you the floor. Are there any questions?
The same situation is in the reflection on Soviet foreign policy, for instance.
Yes. And it is also taken by some groups of Western scholars. For example, it can be used, I mean, for example, world system theory by Immanuel Wallerstein, that every non-Western society is a victim of Western domination, which is partially, or maybe not just partially, true. But it could be used or misused exactly as a justification for projects like Lenin's project from imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. So this is this point when I would say conceptual vision of relations between the West and the rest forms a starting point for new, I would say, imperial legitimacy. That's something which I wanted to summarize once again. But here, your questions maybe, or commentaries. Of course, all participants of the panel are also invited to comment on each other points. Yes, please.
Okay, so maybe I will start the discussion. First of all, thank you very much for mentioning Adam Ulam and let's say his seminal work on expansion and coexistence. And in a very practical sense, we simply see the revival of this, not a concept, but simply an observation of continuity, what Mara Kornat said, of Soviet and Russian foreign policy today. So, of course, general it is a little bit more complicated, and political science could give us some other answers as well. However, I think it is important to emphasize. The second remark is on this totalitarianism and the general discussion which we had in 60s, 70s, 80s between supporters of this concept developed starting from Hannah Arendt and then Brzezinski and Friedrich and then some others. However, let's say it was contested by so-called revisionism, and I should say that this revisionism is still alive in different formats, and let's say maybe there will be another occasion, let's say, to talk about this more broadly. However, it is this concept that we can compare, for example, Western imperialism with Russian imperialism. There are simply two imperialisms, so there is no difference. Yes, there is one big country which has some ambitions, and there are some other Western countries with similar ambitions. Yes, so in political science, why don't we have this opportunity to compare this? And maybe following what Darius Staliunas said, my question to the panel is, apart from this remark on, let's say, emancipation of Jews, I didn't understand at all what you said about this topic, so maybe there will be a chance to discuss this later. However, the question is about this decolonization trap. Because the last conference of Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies had a slogan of decolonization as a leading thought. This year we'll meet for liberation as another, let's say, slogan. However, just we should remember that the colonization concept was used as a thought or as a certain engine and also as a certain action in Soviet times by the Soviet Union. The colonization was a slogan used on the other side, let's say, of the Iron Curtain, simply to strengthen what Professor Novak said of some emancipation needs of the nations of, let's say, some groups in Africa, Asia, and in other parts of the world. And I think that we still cope with certain heritage of this. So, okay, when we Westernians are using the colonization concept and we are trying to reverse what the rest of the world is thinking about this. Is it achievable? It is a question. So I will leave it with this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So my suggestion is that we take 3 questions, maybe. If there will be 3, I hope there will be. Yes, please. And then we will give again the floor to the participants of the panel. Please, here.
Oh. I can start my question. And
oh, please, go ahead.
Or
please.
Thank you. Thank you. My question and comment is for Professor Staliunas. I really appreciated what you said, and I think you captured something that I was not able to understand for a long time about the definitions of empire and the 2 strategies to concentrate on how empire functions internally and externally. And my feeling is that these 2 scholars often ignore this between these 2 camps, because those who concentrate on the internal functioning of empire, they see empire as a synonym for accepting diversity and nation state as a synonym for drive for totality and unity. And on those who concentrate on the external power, it's quite the opposite. Empire is a drive for totality, nation state accepting the diversity. Are there any scholars or any perspective that actually manage to put the both, to concentrate on both perspectives on the same time and not to be just in one camp or another? And my second question is about the empire. Maybe our difficulty to define the empire is because we use a substantialist ontology and we try to understand what empire is and not what empire is doing, not employing. In the nationalist studies, we are talking about nationalization as a process, trying to employ a processual ontology. Is there something similar to this, to a processual ontology happening in the imperial studies now? Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a quick comment that picks up on what Slavik Lukashevich said, and then a question for the panel. One of the legacies of what Slavik talked about is that during the Russia's war in Ukraine, the very significant number of countries in former colonial areas, especially Africa and South Asia and the like, have supported Russia, or at least not opposed it. And they claim that, in fact, the West is, Western countries are reverting to imperialism by trying to oppose Russia. It's a strange argument to make, but it is the legacy of what Slavik was referring to. One quick comment on empire itself as a notion. The connotation of it has varied over time. In the 19th century, for example, it was seen as a mark of being a great power to, and this would go to what Dominic Levin had mentioned, is that if you wanted to be a great power, you should aspire to become an empire through an overseas colonial empire. And it was seen as a, in many Western countries, as a positive thing. That changed in the early 20th century as a result of particularly the rise of nationalism and then Lenin's push in an anti-colonial direction, even though the Soviet Union was an anti-colonial empire of itself. And then the as after the First World War, the push for decolonization began to create a stigma around empire. And particularly in the wake of, with the rise of Nazi Germany and then Stalinist push, it began to have a stigma with it. And that was accentuated by the US war in Vietnam, where the United States was accused of being an imperial power, both within the United States but outside. And then in the late 1980s, separatist movements and opposition groups in the Soviet Union began to really emphasize that the Soviet Union was an illegitimate empire. So the phrase in the 20th century picked up a distinctly negative connotation in a way that continues to have it today, and that has influenced the policies of a lot of African countries and South Asian countries toward Russia during the war.
Thank you very much for this commentary. Now we will give the floor to the, there were several commentaries and at least one question to Darius, but before I will ask you also for the answer for this question, because it seemed to me very interesting, your suggestion that post-Crimean reforms of Alexander II and the results of 1905-1907 revolution were, if not negligible, then at least not that big. That's very interesting. I'm not entering any polemics. I'm just interested in developing this fascinating view. I want to sum up quickly some thoughts that were presented here. The idea of forming empire as the initial stage of developing the concept, let's say since 17th, 18th century, as a symbol of status, was best summed up in a British term issued in Latin, ex imperio libertas, but I'm going to add to this a Russian adage uttered by Mikhail Lermontov, "Puskай я раб, но раб царя вселенной," which means, let me be slave, but the slave of the emperor of the earth, the universal emperor. So the question is, who is to be liberated? Who is free in that empire? And the answer is, the free is our collective, ruled by our, that's a paradox with democratic terms, because it is legitimized by the large part of society, which do not need to have its share in, I would say, internal self-government, but does want to have share in this liberty of dominating over others, expanding against others, share in pride, imperial pride, exactly the pride from 17th or 18th century of emperors. And if I may finish this definition, contemporary definition of imperialism, it is to have liberty of occupying other and presenting it as liberating it from the West. This is my shortest definition of contemporary imperialism. So maybe you could answer the question.
Okay, I got some comments, and I'll try to combine some of the comments and questions. The one was about the Jewish emancipation. What I had in mind that the despotism and the repressiveness of the Tsarist empire in the 19th century should be explained not only by ideology, not only by tradition, geopolitical circumstances, but also by some kind of coincidences, like the fact that Russia didn't lose any serious war in the 19th century. And if we look at other states in the 19th century, we see that Jewish emancipation, as an example, happened after such events, after revolutions and after lost wars. And now the reaction to Andrzej, yes, I mean, the changes were very serious in the mid-19th century after the Russia lost Crimean War, and then, of course, in 1905. But still, there was a red line with the Jewish emancipation. Then there was a kind of pessimism with regard to decolonization. I will share your pessimism, or not, maybe not pessimism, but I mean the question mark with regard to the future of East European studies in the United States. But I am quite optimistic about the Germany. And what I see, I think there is a huge sea change, and how German scholars are united in trying to defend the case of Ukraine. I'm very surprised, except for one historian. I will not mention his name here. Then there was a question about the historians who are combining these two aspects of empire, the one internal and another external, and actually nobody came to my mind at the moment. Maybe there are some scholars, but just I was unable to now to find them in my mind. And you also posted another question, which I was not able to catch, but we might discuss that afterwards. It sounded very interesting, but I mean, I need an explanation. Yeah.
That's what coffee breaks are for. Do you have any more commentaries? There is one more question, maybe two questions. Okay, two last questions. Yes, please. Maybe first this and then.
So very brief question, because when you talk about the empires, there is always some sort of universal appealing model of development that empire has. For example, if we speak about the American empire, there is this appealing liberal democracy that can be universalized. But when we speak about Russia, is there something that is very similar to that universal model? I think not, but maybe I would like to hear your opinion on that.
I have a small comment for Professor Marek Kornat. I deal with French-Russian relation and analyze scientific production about Russia in France. I am skeptical about whether any change in thinking about Russia are possible in France. In France. Excuse me, I am total francophone. Excuse me. I will give an example. The last very known publication in France this year is Emmanuel Todt, Le défaite de l'Occident. So Emmanuel Todt is very known historian and anthropologist Français, professor. It received, that book received the prize de Le Mans. What is significant that the thesis wrote in this book about Russia, about aggression Russia contra Ukraine and discreditation of Ukraine didn't cause a protest any scientists Français. On the other hand, the grand discussion which was result to the thesis of the Emmanuel Todt are why the war in Ukraine can lead to the destruction of the West. Only Ukraine employed and the French university protest against applying Russian narration for writing about Ukraine. Excuse me for English.
No. Thank you so much. If I may, just before giving for the last word in this panel, all the participants, the microphones, I want to make a short introduction to the answer to your question. Actually, it was made by your continuator, the next person asking a question, namely the appeal to the crisis of the West is something that makes Russian ideology so deeply ingrained in Russian Moscow tradition, worldwide attractive. This is one part. The second part, the second wing of this two-headed and two-wing eagle of Russian imperialism is, of course, still communism. Communism based on I would say, Western type of interpretation or anti-imperialist interpretation that was given by Lenin. Even though communism is not an official ideology of Putin, this concept of Russia as leading the rebellion of the rest against the West is still very vivid, as was stressed also by Professor Martin. So I think there are some elements disparaged, not logically united, but very effectively used as universal, I would say, justification for Russian role and Russian expansion as liberation. Expansion as liberation. That's very, I would say, typical for that type of imperial ideology. But I talked too much, so maybe to end. Are there any comments from the participants to the last question? Yes, please.
Concerning your remarks, I think that we should remember that the Soviet Empire was the most universalist. This was the observation by Professor Viktor Sukiennicki, because it wanted to bring this communist paradise to all nations, and probably there was no other so universalist empire. This is, of course, utopian universalism. This is my short commentary in connection with your remarks or question. And concerning France, I don't agree with your so pessimistic view. We should know that before 1989, the situation in historiography, in sociology in this country was radically different than actually. When Professor Leszek Kołakowski published Main Currents of Marxism, Główne nurty marksizmu, the volume number 3 were prohibited in France. It was absolutely impossible to produce French translation because it deals about the Stalinist Marxism and the collapse of totalitarian ideological project. And now, after the publication of the Livre Noir du Communisme, Czarna Księga Komunizmu, situation was significantly changed, in my opinion. However, it produced a sharp discussion, of course. We have many important figures in French historiography, actually, who are in conflict with this pro-Soviet, pro-communist line as it was dominating in the French historical thinking on Russia, etc. Stéphane Courtois, Enzo Traverso, Henri Rousseau, and I can add many other, Yves Santamaria, for instance, the author of the work on Pact, on Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. We have different changes, but significant in my opinion. One of them is the introducing of the term totalitarianism to French historical thought. This term was abolished in French, neglected in French historical thought earlier. And my opinion is rather moderate, more moderate than yours, probably. Thank you for question.
Thank you very much. If there are no more comments or questions, I want to close with a kind of counterpoint to what you said, that everything or many things simply are connected with a particular point of view. To what an extent the historians you mentioned and political scientists you mentioned form the mainstream opinion in France is a question, because I still do remember this view from Channel 2nd, French state television, on February, it was February 26th, 2 days after the aggression, 22. A rapporteur from Kiev was underwritten in the television, Kiev, Russie. So that was probably closer to a general view of the French.
But I was speaking on historiography.
Yes, yes, of course. So I want just to stress something that Darius already stated, that our discussions are important because they could influence, though unfortunately or fortunately, it depends on the point of view, in a very limited way, the more general, I would say, mood or way of perceiving things that seem to us important. And with this caveat, let me close this very interesting, for me, from my perspective, panel, and let me thank you, all the panelists, and you for patience and your questions. Thank you very much.
And will be snapped.